name has carried centuries of dark reputation. But how well do we actually know Jezebel, the Phoenician queen who dared to defy the God of Israel? She brought foreign gods into the heart of the kingdom and hunted down his prophets. Her life remains one of the most polarizing and violent sagas in Scripture. This is a story of absolute power, deep manipulation, and a sudden, crushing judgment. Before our story ends tonight, you will see exactly why her shadow still lingers after thousands of years, a stark warning about what happens when we trade faith for temporary earthly power. Before we travel back in time, if you appreciate these deep histories, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It truly helps us grow. Share in the comments where you are listening from tonight and what time it is there. We love building this community together. Let us begin our story now. Blood in the dust. The sun slowly sinks toward the horizon over the ancient city of Jezreel. Dust settles in the narrow streets as long shadows stretch over the stone. A royal chariot rumbles through the palace gates. The driver, Jehu, is a fierce commander with burning eyes. He has arrived with a grim, terrible purpose. His soldiers crowd close behind him, their bronze weapons catching the final glints of daylight. High above, framed in an upper window, stands a woman. Dark makeup rings her eyes. Her face is carefully, deliberately painted. Her jewelry catches the fading sun like a mirror. She is not hiding. She is not running. Unyielding and defiant, she calls down, "Is it peace?" But peace is not what this warrior brings today. Jehu looks up at the painted queen and shouts his command, "Throw her down!" The eunuchs standing beside her pause for only a second. Their loyalty shatters. Rough hands push against her royal robes. A scream tears through the evening air. Then comes the sickening sound of a body hitting stone. Heavy horse hooves crush what is left. Jehu walks inside the palace to feast and celebrate his conquest. Later, when servants go to bury her because she was, after all, a king's daughter, they find almost nothing. Just a skull, 2 hands, and 2 feet. The rest has been devoured by the wild dogs of the streets. This is the word of the Lord. Jehu declares, spoken through Elijah the Tishbite, "On the ground of Jezreel, dogs will eat the flesh of Jezebel." And so ends the life of one of history's most notorious queens. Her name would forever stand as a symbol of wickedness and defiance. She was a foreign princess who carried her gods into the heart of Israel. She was a queen who challenged prophets and plotted murder. A ruler whose painted face in that high window remains one of the Bible's most haunting images. But who was the real Jezebel? Was she truly the monster her enemies claimed? What forces shaped this woman who dared to defy a God she did not serve? To understand her, we have to look at the world that made her. A landscape of rival kingdoms, ancient deities, and the shifting political tides of the ancient Near East. Her life was a clash of cultures, religious passion, and raw hunger for power. This is the story of a woman who refused to break, even when facing prophets who called fire from heaven. It is about power, who holds it and who chases it, and what are people willing to sacrifice to keep it. In the quiet aftermath of her death, as dogs licked blood from the stones of Jezreel, a haunting question lingers. How did a princess of Tyre become the most hated woman in Scripture? What changed this royal daughter into a queen who defied God? To find that out, we must go back before the blood, before the prophets, and before her name made the faithful tremble. We must travel to a time when Israel was still young and fragile, surrounded by empires, and the stage was set for one of Scripture's most explosive clashes. The dust settles, and the dogs retreat into the shadows, but Jezebel's story is far from over. Though her body is gone, her story remains a warning to some, a fascination to others, and a memory of what happens when human will collides with divine purpose. Long before Jezebel drew her first breath, The lands that would shape her life were already ancient. Israel, which was not yet a unified kingdom, lived as a loose gathering of tribes bound by a shared ancestry and faith in Yahweh. To the north lay Phoenicia, a wealthy seafaring civilization with busy port cities like Tyre and Sidon along the Mediterranean coast. These two worlds stood in sharp contrast. Israel, still finding its footing after generations of wandering, was mostly a quiet inland farming society. The people lived close to the land, planting and harvesting by the seasons. Their God was invisible, speaking through prophets rather than temples or carved idols. Phoenicia, by contrast, overflowed with wealth from the sea. Their ships, crafted from the famous cedars of Lebanon, sailed to distant lands, returning with gold, ivory, and luxury goods. Their cities featured grand temples where gods were worshipped with dramatic sensory rituals. Chief among their gods were Baal, who controlled the rain, and Asherah, the goddess of fertility. The Israelites had only recently established their monarchy. After the chaotic era of the judges, they demanded a king to match the nations around them. First came Saul, troubled and eventually rejected. Then David, the shepherd king, who united the tribes and established Jerusalem. His son Solomon expanded the kingdom even further, building the magnificent First Temple and securing peace treaties with the surrounding empires. But after Solomon died, disaster struck. The kingdom split in two, northern Israel with its capital in Samaria, and southern Judah anchored by Jerusalem. The northern kingdom, where our story takes place, struggled for legitimacy from the start. Its first king, Jeroboam, deeply feared that his people's loyalty would drift back south if they kept traveling to Jerusalem to worship. His solution changed history forever. He built rival temples at Dan and Bethel, setting up golden calves. From its very birth, the northern kingdom struggled with true worship. This spiritual divide created the perfect soil for Jezebel's influence to grow. And while political power shifted constantly, a powerful prophetic movement was quietly gathering strength. Unlike temple priests and their highly structured, ordained rituals, these prophets claimed direct personal communication with Yahweh. They appeared quite unexpectedly from all walks of life. Some were highly educated, while others were simple farmers or shepherds. What bound them together was one bold declaration: "Thus says the Lord." These prophets served as Israel's conscience, confronting kings who strayed from Yahweh's commands. They stood outside the corridors of power, completely unafraid to deliver messages no one wanted to hear. Kings commanded armies, but prophets commanded words that could shake the foundations of kingdoms. Up in the hill country, small farming communities preserved older, simpler expressions of faith. These rural believers frequently clashed with the cosmopolitan attitudes developing in cities like Samaria. They regarded foreign alliances with deep suspicion, seeing them as direct threats to Israel's distinct identity and its covenant bond with Yahweh. This was the landscape Jezebel would eventually enter. A divided kingdom with religious tensions running just beneath the surface, prophetic movements gathering momentum, and a constant grinding tension between isolation and foreign cultures. The stage was set for massive conflict. Israel's kings pursued political stability through foreign alliances, while prophets demanded religious purity. Rural communities held tightly to old traditions, while cities welcomed new ideas. Ancient tribal loyalties clashed with newer political structures. In this fragile, uncertain environment, leadership changed hands repeatedly. The northern kingdom watched dynasty after dynasty collapse through assassinations and coups without the stabilizing anchor of David's royal bloodline. Israel's throne was a dangerous prize, seized again and again through brutal violence. This was the world waiting for Jezebel, a land of opportunity and deep peril, where a foreign princess might find herself holding unexpected power. A place where the collision of gods and cultures was moving toward open conflict. Tyre and the daughters of Baal. Tyre rose from the Mediterranean like something carved from stone cedar and dream. Part of the city spread along the mainland, but its true heart beat on an island fortress just off the coast, nearly impossible to breach. It was surrounded by waters shifting from turquoise shallows to deep sapphire depths. Here, inside one of the ancient world's greatest maritime empires, Jezebel was born a princess. The Phoenicians were not what they called themselves. That name came from the Greeks, referring to their famous deep purple dye. They called themselves Canaanites, and their land simply the coast. Their true gift lay in trade rather than bloody conquest. While other empires expanded through brutal warfare, Tyre built its massive strength through commerce and craftsmanship. Phoenician ships were the envy of every nation bordering the Mediterranean. Their sailors navigated by starlight to reach shores as distant as Spain and North Africa, and perhaps even Britain. They returned with silver, gold, and ivory that poured into Tyre's bustling harbors. The markets overflowed with marvels, delicate glasswork, and beautifully carved ivory. There were textiles dyed in the legendary Tyrian purple, so costly that wearing it was restricted to royalty alone. In this world of wealth and deep refinement, religion was never a private matter. It was the pulse of daily life. Towering above the city stood the great temples of Melkart, the city's patron deity, Baal Sham, in Lord of the Heavens, and Astarte, Queen of Heaven. Unlike the worship of Yahweh, which strictly forbade any physical images, Phoenician religion fully embraced the visual and the sensory. Massive golden statues caught the hot sunlight. Incense perfumed every sacred space. Music filled the air around the shrines. Baal, the storm god who delivered life-giving rain, held special importance in this seafaring culture. His consort Asherah, represented by sacred poles or living trees, embodied fertility and the overflowing abundance of nature. Their worship included seasonal festivals marking the agricultural calendar, celebrations that could become quite exuberant, even sensual by strict Israelite standards. These temple complexes served as major administrative centers. Priests were not just religious figures, but political players who managed vast, wealthy temple estates. Sacred prostitution, a practice that deeply horrified Israelite prophets, formed a core part of the fertility rituals honoring Astarte. The line between religious devotion and statecraft blurred, completely shaping Jezebel's future approach to power. Phoenician princesses received an education that was highly unusual for women of their era. They learned multiple languages for diplomatic purposes. They studied history, literature, and the complex religious ceremonies they would eventually need to perform in foreign courts. A royal daughter like Jezebel would have been trained from childhood in the art of soft power and subtle influence. These daughters of Tyre were incredibly valuable diplomatic instruments. Marriages secured, critical trade routes stabilized borders, and forged military partnerships. When a Phoenician princess traveled to a foreign court, she carried not just her dowry, but deep cultural connections that served her homeland long after the wedding day. She remained her father's daughter even as another man's wife. The palace where Jezebel grew up hummed with international visitors, Egyptian officials in white linen, Assyrian ambassadors with carefully curled beards, and merchants from distant islands speaking strange tongues. She watched her father, King Ethbaal, whose name carried the meaning "with Baal," navigate these complex diplomatic currents, building alliances while protecting Tyre's independence. Ethbaal himself had risen to power through unconventional, bloody means. Ancient sources suggest he was originally a priest of Astarte, seizing the throne by force. This blending of religious and political authority shaped Jezebel's understanding of power from her earliest years. She grew up seeing no contradiction whatsoever between serving her gods and wielding massive worldly influence. As a princess of Tyre, Jezebel's religious identity was inseparable from her political role. The gods blessed and legitimized royal authority, and in return, royalty built grand temples and funded public rituals. The notion that religion could ever be separated from statecraft would have been completely foreign to her. All these forces, vast wealth, deep faith, sharp diplomacy, and culture, came together to shape the young woman who would eventually enter Israel. Born into one of the ancient world's most open, wealthy societies, she learned early on that foreign alliances were a source of strength, never weakness. She carried an unshakable certainty. Baal sent the storms that brought life. Asherah gave the fertility that ensured prosperity. Honoring these gods was a royal duty, the absolute salvation of any wise kingdom. This entire worldview, so deep within her, was about to crash into the fierce, uncompromising monotheism of Israel. The fallout from that collision would be greater than either nation could ever imagine. A princess was being shaped inside the stone walls of Tyre. Young Jezebel woke every morning to the sound of the sea. Waves crashed against the island city in a steady, ancient rhythm, a constant reminder of both safety and endless possibility. Her rooms, probably overlooking the busy harbor, showed merchant ships sliding in and out, their bright sails catching the Mediterranean sun. Her days followed a strict royal routine. Every morning, servants dressed her in fine linen, dyed in the famous costly purple that signaled her high rank. Heavy gold jewelry carved with lotus blossoms adorned her wrists and neck. Dark makeup defined her eyes and sharp features, a ritual she would carry with her right until her final moments. Her education went far beyond what most ancient women could dream of. Private tutors taught her to read and write in several languages. The Phoenicians had developed an alphabet of only 22 letters, changing communication forever. It made reading easier to learn, though it was still mostly for the wealthy. Her religious studies, however, were exceptionally thorough. One day, she would represent her native faith abroad. She mastered complex temple rituals, the timing of festivals, and the powers of each god. She memorized prayers, practiced holy dances, and studied how the gods interacted with the world. Music filled her days. Sounds of lyres, drums, and cymbals echoed through both holy ceremonies and royal feasts. She likely trained in sacred dances for Astarte, celebrating feminine power and the cycle of life. These customs, so natural to her, would eventually shock the people of Israel. Meanwhile, the palace itself became her political classroom. Hidden behind screens, she watched her father welcome foreign envoys and negotiate treaties, holding together the alliance that made Tyre rich. She watched him balance strength with compromise, learning when to strike and when to yield. Her father, King Ethbaal, was a force of nature. He began as a priest of Astarte before seizing the throne, likely through violence. This meant Jezebel grew up watching a father who held both sacred and royal power, a dual authority she would later try to build in Israel. His name alone claimed the backing of the gods, and the palace complex of Tyre housed far more than just the royal family. Advisors, priests, soldiers, and servants made it a bustling city within a city. Young Jezebel moved through this world of rivalries and shifting loyalties, learning early that real power lay not in official titles, but in alliances, secrets, and perception. Banquets displayed Tyre's immense wealth in the most obvious ways. Fresh seafood from the sea, ripe produce from the coastal plains, and imported wines were served on fine silver and delicate pottery. Eating was never just about hunger, but a performance of status, a chance to talk politics. Up in the women's quarters, Jezebel learned the hard truths of survival from her mother and aunts. They taught her how to run a royal estate, how crucial it was to bear heirs, and the quiet ways a woman could influence decisions in a world ruled by men. She saw that a queen's power often ran through quiet, indirect channels. It was about whispers in private strategic alliances and controlling who got to see the king. Holy festivals split the year into vivid chapters. During Baal's autumn feast, the city celebrated the return of the life-giving rains. Spring rituals honored Astarte with wild displays of fertility and renewal. These massive ecstatic feasts, full of music and deep passion, defined what true worship meant to her. It was the complete opposite of the quiet, temple-centered worship of Yahweh in Israel. As she grew, she knew exactly what lay ahead: a political marriage to a foreign ruler. Girls born to Phoenician royalty were prepared for this since childhood. They were living treaties, flesh and blood proof of peace between nations. Their weddings sealed alliances, securing trade routes that made both empires rich. But what truly set Jezebel apart was the sheer fire of her personal faith. She was never just a casual worshiper of Baal and Asherah. She was a true, fierce, committed believer, driven to spread her gods far beyond the borders of Tyre. Whether this fire was lit in childhood or came later is hard to say, but her actions inside Israel reveal a queen who refused to abandon her gods even when compromise was the safer option. As she grew into a young woman and began appearing at public events, foreign diplomats visiting Tyre quickly took notice. Her physical beauty, sharp mind, and royal grace made her a highly valuable political asset. And somewhere there, envoys from the northern kingdom of Israel saw an opportunity. A princess who could bring Phoenician gold and navy power to their side. Israel had no queen. The northern kingdom constantly shook with instability, unlike the southern kingdom of Judah, which was held steady by David's unbroken line. In the north, kings rose and fell with terrifying speed. Most did not die of old age, they were removed by bloodshed. The land needed more than just a ruler. It needed a stabilizing force, perhaps a strong queen to secure foreign alliances and bring some peace at home. When Solomon died and the nation fractured, trouble arrived almost instantly. Jeroboam, the first king of the north, worried his people would drift back south to worship at the temple in Jerusalem. His fix changed everything. He set up rival shrines at Dan and Bethel, complete with golden calves, announcing, "Here are your gods, O Israel." It was a deliberate echo of the Golden Calf rebellion in the wilderness centuries earlier. This religious compromise set a grim pattern. Northern kings constantly put political gain over faith. The prophets slammed this behavior without hesitation. Yet physically, these kings were tackling massive practical issues. How do you rule a rebel nation? How do you build a separate identity when Jerusalem's temple still pulls at your people's hearts? Brutal violence defined every single transfer of power. Jeroboam's son Nadab ruled for only 2 years before Baasha assassinated him, wiping out the entire royal bloodline. Baasha's own son Eli suffered the exact same fate, murdered while drunk by his own chariot commander Zimri, who immediately slaughtered every male relative of the old dynasty. Zimri lasted exactly 7 days on the throne. When word of this coup reached the army in the field, the soldiers immediately crowned their general Omri. Cornered inside the palace at Tsar, burned the building down, dying in the fire rather than surrender. Then came civil war as a rival named Tibni challenged Omri for the crown. For 4 bloody years, the kingdom was torn apart until Omri finally won total control. All this constant bloodshed destroyed any sense of trust or security. Royal children grew up realizing their very blood made them targets for execution. Palace officials scanned the room for any shift in power. Meanwhile, everyday people suffered under leaders who only cared about surviving. Into this brutal world stepped Omri, a hardened general who valued practical results over any religious rules. Though the biblical text condemns him for doing evil in the eyes of God, ancient records show his massive achievements, including building a brand new capital city at Samaria, which was sitting safely on a high hill overlooking the valleys. It had freshwater springs, making it perfect for surviving long military sieges. Omri did what no previous king could manage. He created enough stability to start a true royal dynasty. Under his rule, Israel earned global respect. Assyrian tablets called the nation the House of Omri long after he died, showing just how powerful his influence really was. He secured his borders using raw military power and clever marriage alliances, connecting his kingdom to Judah by marrying off his son Ahab to the Judean princess Athaliah. As Omri aged, Ahab ruled closely by his side, ready to inherit the peace his father had fought so hard to secure. Yet one crucial piece was still missing from their grand strategy: a strong northern ally to balance their southern connection with Judah. Wealthy, seafaring Phoenicia was the perfect fit. These smart political arrangements brought huge religious problems. Marriage alliances back then always required honoring the foreign bride's religion. These royal women brought more than money. They brought their own priests, their foreign idols, and the absolute demand to worship them. This standard diplomatic custom would test Israel's loyalty to Yahweh like never before. But God's prophets had grown much stronger during these chaotic years, rising up as bold, countercultural voices, challenging royal power whenever it strayed. They weren't like court prophets who only said what pleased the king. These wild outsiders spoke highly dangerous truths at massive personal risk. Meanwhile, rural Israelites, especially in the rugged hills, kept a strict faith in Yahweh. They watched the king's religious compromises with deep, growing dread. This friction between city politics and country faith, between raw survival and religious purity, split the nation right down the middle. And honestly, there had never been a powerful queen in Israel. Kings had wives, sure, but no woman had ever shaped the politics of the north until Jezebel arrived. She stepped into that empty space with a power nobody was ready to face, unleashing a fierce feminine authority onto a land ruled by male bloodshed. When Ahab took the throne, the nation desperately needed peace. They had endured decades of coups, civil wars, and deep religious splits. Omri had patched things up with sheer military muscle and smart deals. Now his son Ahab had to finish the job by looking north to Phoenicia, chasing an alliance with a wealthy, seafaring empire. A Phoenician princess would bring massive trade wealth and global respect to Israel. But neither father nor son could foresee how this single political deal would destroy their national faith. This foreign princess was no fragile diplomatic trophy. She had an iron will and a completely unbreakable drive. Jezebel was a fierce servant of Baal and Asherah, destined to become the most hated queen in Israel's history. In the rich palaces of Tyre, two kings sat down to redraw the map. Ethbaal of Phoenicia and Omri of Israel were both cold, practical rulers who had seized their thrones through blood and cunning. They saw clear benefits in this alliance, using quiet messengers for months before any direct talks began. It was a cold deal built on mutual gain instead of shared beliefs. Phoenicia offered Israel desperately needed international legitimacy, deep trade networks, and exotic luxury goods to lift the northern kingdom. In return, Israel gave Phoenicia a massive shield against inland enemies, securing vital trade routes south through Jerusalem. The wedding between Tyre's Princess Jezebel and Ahab, the crown prince of Israel, would seal the deal. These royal weddings were treaties. These contracts detailed far more than dowries. They laid out religious rules, trade rights, and military alliances. King Ethbaal demanded strict clauses so his daughter could still worship her own gods. Omri was looking at power, not piety. He saw this as a cheap price for huge geopolitical rewards. But for Jezebel, the reality of this alliance must have been heavy. Marrying a foreign prince meant saying goodbye to her home forever. She had been prepared for this duty from childhood, yet the actual parting cut deep. Still, these arrangements offered rare leverage for a woman. She would enter the foreign palace as her father's direct ambassador, wielding an influence far prior to a normal queen. The kingdom scrambled to prepare. They packed a massive dowry of gold, silver, fine fabrics, and skilled Phoenician builders. Priests of Baal and Asherah were chosen to travel with her, making sure her home gods would be worshipped properly. A whole retinue of servants, maids, and loyal advisors was assembled. Each one was a living lifeline back to Tyre, ensuring she would never feel completely isolated. Her caravan set off from Tyre, winding down coastal roads before cutting east into the hills of Israel. It was a massive royal caravan, guarded and heavily loaded, rolling slowly through the countryside. In every dusty village, people watched and waited. For the common farmers of Israel, this was their first taste of Phoenician splendor and their first glimpse of the woman who would rule them. In Samaria, King Omri prepared. His young capital needed to impress a princess born in wealthy Tyre. This likely sparked the building of the famous Ivory Palace of Samaria, a grand residence filled with intricate ivory carvings that archaeologists have now unearthed. These treasures, featuring clear Phoenician designs, were the physical proof of the cultural collision this wedding brought. Word of the upcoming royal wedding divided the nation. Palace elites were thrilled, eyeing new fortunes and influence through the Tyre alliance. Traders expected business to boom. But out in the villages, those loyal to the traditional worship of Yahweh felt a deep chill. A pagan queen meant pagan gods on holy ground. Soon, independent prophets began whispering dark warnings. The scriptures record few details of their early protests, but later struggles prove that the resistance was brewing from day one. These rough, plain-spoken holy men stood in stark contrast to the elegant Phoenician priests who traveled in Jezebel's train. When Ahab and Jezebel finally met, they looked at partners from completely different universes. He was a soldier's son, raised in an unstable land of coups and civil war, where staying alive meant trading principles for power. She was a refined princess of Tyre, highly educated in both theology and statecraft, raised to believe that the king's word and God's word were the exact same thing. Their wedding became a delicate diplomatic dance. It honored both nations while cementing a brand new alliance. King Omri used the feast to show off his wealth, giving Israelite nobles their first real taste of Phoenician luxury. It was beautiful, fascinating, and deeply troubling all at once. The political payoff was fast and obvious. Israel's status surged across the region, backed by the wealth and prestige of Tyre. Trade flourished along secure highways. Soon, Phoenician styles and architecture began transforming the look of Samaria, turning the backwater capital into a worldly city that matched Omri's grand ambitions. Yet beneath the new wealth, spiritual division was already brewing. The wedding treaty guaranteed Jezebel the right to worship Baal and Asherah, which meant building holy sites. Shrines rose. Pagan altars were set up. Foreign priests moved in. Each pagan temple deepened the horror for those loyal to Yahweh alone. Neither Omri nor Ethbaal saw how this marriage would shatter Israel. What started as a routine political wedding with a foreign bride quietly keeping her hometown gods would spiral into a bitter war of faith. Jezebel believed that crown and altar were completely inseparable, and she refused to hide her prayers in a dark corner of the palace. She brought a zeal to convert her new home, threatening to tear Israel apart. A pragmatic deal between two old kings had unleashed a storm they could never control. A dark era in Israelite history was beginning not by the march of armies, but through the simple pen strokes of a wedding contract. For now, the coming disaster was just a tiny cloud on the horizon. The royal caravan slowly climbed the final hill toward the gates of Samaria. Inside a shaded, ornate carriage protected from the sun and dust sat Jezebel, no longer just a princess of Tyre, but the future queen of Israel. The new capital rising before her must have seemed remarkably modest compared to her grand island home. Samaria was Omri's crowning achievement, a brand new capital built from scratch on a hilltop overlooking every surrounding valley. The site blended natural defense with easy access to vital trade routes. Workers were still laying stone for new fortifications as the wedding procession approached. Here was a city rising to greatness, mirroring the kingdom itself. Along the road, the gathering crowds showed the true face of Israelite society. Court officials in their finest robes stood right by the gates, poised to deliver formal welcomes. Behind them crowded merchants hungry for Phoenician trade, artisans curious about foreign craftsmanship, and everyday folks just looking for a show. Farther back, watching with cold, guarded eyes, stood the rural Israelites. Their devotion to Yahweh made them deeply suspicious of foreign ways. For Jezebel, this first look at her subjects likely confirmed every warning from her diplomatic briefings. Israel was fractured split from Judah and deeply divided within by religious tensions and tribal loyalties. Raw scars from recent civil wars left the nation broken. Where she saw a chance to unite them, others saw a dangerous foreign invasion. The formal welcome followed ancient rules, traditional speeches, symbolic gifts, and rehearsed gestures. Every move honored her royal blood and her new role as Ahab's bride. King Omri, old but still imposing, led the way. He stood before the crowd to show this marriage had his absolute support. Yet Ahab himself remains a mystery in these early moments. Scripture tells us almost nothing about his feelings for his Phoenician bride. Dynastic marriages rarely started with love or warmth, but the best of them often grew into real partnerships. One thing is certain across all their years together: Ahab never tried to limit Jezebel's worship or her political power. Maybe he agreed with her, or maybe he just could not stop her. Jezebel's first days in Samaria meant finding her footing in an unfamiliar world. The royal palace, while impressive to locals, probably seemed basic to a princess raised among the riches of Tyre. Local food, simple garments, and foreign customs all took getting used to. Even the weather was harsh. Samaria's inland hills brought hotter summers and colder winters than her coastal home. The language barrier was another hurdle. Though her royal tutors had taught her basic Hebrew, the subtle slang and unspoken local expressions were completely foreign to her. Rival court officials surely took advantage of this weakness to protect their own power, slipping easily into regional dialects whenever delicate political topics came up. Setting up her altars caused trouble right away. Her marriage contract guaranteed her freedom to worship her gods, but turning that promise into reality meant spending real money and finding prime land. Where would the temple of Baal be built? Who pays the priests? How would the pagan festivals be run? These were not just administrative problems. Each decision struck at the heart of Israel's covenant with Yahweh. The Israelite ladies chosen to serve her brought their own complications. Some saw the job as a massive honor, eager to copy the latest Phoenician styles. Others, however, were almost certainly planted as spies, reporting her private conversations to rival factions. She had to sort friends from enemies among a crowd of strangers. Even as rural prophets who operated far outside royal control started screaming protest. Though their exact words from this early era are not preserved in Scripture, their later fury makes their early resistance completely obvious. These men, dressed in rough clothing and speaking with brutal, unsparing honesty, stood in stark contrast to the sleek Phoenician priests who had traveled with Jezebel. Even with these hurdles, Jezebel had massive advantages. Her royal schooling had prepared her for exactly this kind of political maneuvering. She brought immense wealth to buy off loyalty and build influence. Above all, she carried her father's authority as his daughter and chief representative, a power that went far beyond being just Ahab's wife. Slowly, she carved out her own space inside the royal palace. Soon, Phoenician styles began filling her quarters, including fine furniture inlaid with ivory and wall hangings showing scenes from her homeland. She was steadily introducing her own culture into these plain Israelite rooms. These visual updates were just outward signs of the massive shift she was bringing. When Omri's health began to fail, Ahab took over more of the daily ruling with Jezebel right by his side. When Omri finally died, the handoff of power went incredibly smoothly. It was the very first peaceful succession in the northern kingdom's bloody history. The peace Omri had bought with his Phoenician alliance seemed to be holding, at least for now. But underneath the pressure was reaching a boiling point. Every public act of Baal worship, every altar built, and every foreign priest hired, and every pagan feast drove the wedge deeper. It divided those who welcomed foreign ties from those fiercely loyal to Yahweh. Jezebel had conquered Samaria physically, but the cultural and religious fusion she brought was still fiercely rejected. In those quiet days before open warfare finally broke out, she probably thought she was just doing her duty as a royal daughter and wife. Actions that felt perfectly normal to her, honoring her gods, sharing her culture, and boosting her husband's power, looked to the locals like a lethal threat. A slow poisoning of Israel's soul by foreign hands. The stage was set for a clash that went far beyond mere individuals. It was a clash between two totally different visions of Israel. Was Ahab a puppet or a master player? The man who shared Jezebel's bed and throne remains one of history's most complicated kings. Was he just a weak-willed husband? Or was he a clever politician who used her power to get what he wanted while keeping his own hands clean? Scripture paints him as a mere puppet, but archaeological discoveries and a closer look at the text suggest a much more complex story. His father, Omri, had to fight his way from army commander to the throne, but Ahab was born directly into royal life. He inherited more than a crown. He got a kingdom that was finally stable after generations of bloody violence. His inheritance set his goals. Keep the peace his father built. Protect the borders through smart alliances. Keep the money flowing to prove his family deserved the throne. We can only guess what he looked like, but the ruined palaces in Samaria show he loved the high life. Think fine stonework and detailed ivory carvings. His massive building projects prove he loved beautiful things. Maybe this shared taste created a real bond with his Phoenician bride, whose homeland was famous for that exact kind of craftsmanship. The Bible mentions Ahab's house of ivory. Obviously, it wasn't made completely of ivory, but it was a grand palace filled with ivory panels and custom furniture. Modern digs prove these ivory decorations were real, and many had Phoenician designs carved right into them. These luxury items weren't just about showing off wealth. They showed off global connections, real proof that Israel was opening up to the world under Omri and Ahab. As a soldier, Ahab was actually a highly capable commander. Both biblical and Assyrian records prove he successfully defended Israel from massive invading armies, especially from Syria. At the Battle of Karkar, he brought one of the largest chariot forces to fight against the massive Assyrian Empire. These victories don't fit the image of a weak, useless king that his spiritual failures might suggest. At home, Ahab was actually a great administrator. He kept up his father's massive building plans, reinforcing walls and forts at key military outposts across the land. Under his watch, Israel's economy boomed. Dirt-digging archaeologists have found clear evidence of rising trade and growing middle-class wealth. No matter his spiritual failures, he gave his people the safety and comfort they wanted from a strong ruler. But his marriage to Jezebel is hard to define. The Bible never once shows Ahab standing up to her, which means he either completely agreed with what she did or simply couldn't stop her. When she had Naboth murdered for his vineyard, Ahab took the stolen land without saying a word. But when Elijah confronted him, Ahab seemed to break down in real guilt, tearing his clothes and fasting. It was a display of sorrow deep enough to put God's judgment on hold. This pattern kept repeating itself. He lets pagan religious practices offend the faithful and benefits from Jezebel's brutal efficiency while keeping his own distance, and then repents when a prophet shows up to call him out. Is that how a henpecked husband acts, or is it the cold calculation of a king who lets his wife take the heat for moves that help him? Scripture describes their marriage in incredibly harsh terms. No one ever sold himself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, quite like Ahab did, egged on by his wife Jezebel. Notice that urged on, not forced or tricked. It sounds more like a partnership than a dictatorship. It shows Ahab was a willing partner in choices that the prophets absolutely hated. Royal court politics definitely made Jezebel even more powerful. As the daughter of Tyre's king, she brought massive prestige to a young, fragile dynasty. Her connections opened up trade routes and built wealth for Israel. The Phoenician priests and servants who traveled with her from Tyre formed a tight, highly loyal group right inside the palace. Ahab's own faith was practical, not passionate. Unlike his wife Jezebel, who was a fanatic for Baal, Ahab played the field. He did what many ancient kings did, honored whatever god made political sense at the time. He kept Yahweh's worship going while letting Baal's temples stand, hedging his spiritual bets to keep his political options open. You can see this deep religious mix-up in their children's names. Some kids got traditional Hebrew names referencing Yahweh, while others had names praising Baal. This was no brainwashed royal family completely controlled, but a court running two religions at once. It was a messy compromise, the exact kind that drove religious purists crazy. Imagine their late-night talks at the end of a long day. Did they quietly plot together on how to manage the nation's religious anger? Did Ahab secretly support policies he pretended to stay away from in public? Did Jezebel willingly act as the lightning rod, taking all the heat from the angry prophets to protect her husband? The Bible drops hints, but gives no easy answers. But one thing is obvious. They built a highly effective partnership regardless of who wore the pants in the family. Together they ruled Israel through a golden age of wealth and major military wins. Their future looked safe with sons lined up to take over the throne. By all normal standards of ancient politics, money, security, and heirs, they were winning, despite the furious warnings of the prophets. Maybe that worldly success explains why they felt so untouchable. Inside the palace, surrounded by gold and overflowing grain, the terrifying warnings of street prophets like Elijah must have sounded completely absurd, totally disconnected from their reality. When the rains came on time and the harvest was plenty, even with Baal worshipped right alongside Yahweh, why take those dark warnings of divine anger seriously? In the end, this easy comfort proved fatal. The religious compromises that once looked so politically smart began tearing Israelite society apart. Jezebel's aggressive push for her foreign gods bred deep, quiet hatred, building a massive wall of enemies waiting in the shadows for their moment. Meanwhile, the very prophets the court dismissed as irrelevant grew tougher under the pressure of persecution. Ahab died just like he lived, a mess of contradictions. Bleeding out on the battlefield, even after putting on a disguise to hide from enemy archers, he ordered his driver to keep him propped upright facing the fight so his men wouldn't panic seeing their leader collapse. That stubborn, desperate act of royal duty shows a king far more complex than just a simple puppet on Jezebel's strings. Pulling the strings or being pulled, Ahab made choices that triggered a slow landslide destined to crush everything he and his queen built. Then came the prophets. Out in the dry hills of Gilead, a hot wind whipped against the coarse camel hair coat of a lone man. From this wild country east of the Jordan came the queen's greatest nightmare, Elijah the Tishbite. His sudden crash into the sacred story shows how these holy men usually arrived, exploding onto the political stage from the dusty margins, far from the halls of power. Prophets weren't new to Israel. Ever since the beginning, leaders like Moses, Deborah, and Samuel had spoken with the very voice of God. But the wildfire spreading under Ahab and Jezebel was entirely different. It was angrier, louder, ready to stare down kings, and obsessed with dragging Israel back to the worship of Yahweh alone. These new voices stood completely outside the temple system. Unlike priests who inherited their jobs and did quiet rituals behind closed doors, these men came out of nowhere, from any family or tribe. Their authority didn't come from human selection, but from a terrifying divine call they felt in their actual bones. They said the hand of the Lord grabbed them. His word burned inside like a physical fire. Just looking at them told you everything. Elijah's animal skins and wild hair were a deliberate slap in the face to the silk and perfume of Ahab's palace. Later, his successor, Elisha, would be ridiculed for his bold appearance, a direct rejection of the elegant, high-class court styles. These weren't polite politicians. They were loud, dangerous truth-tellers. And they didn't do quiet diplomacy. They skipped the official channels, staging wild public scenes that absolutely forced people to look. They performed strange symbolic acts, shouted warnings in crowded markets, and stood toe-to-toe with kings, ignoring all royal protocols. They didn't want minor political shifts. They demanded a total instant return to their sacred promise with God. The message was simple: absolute, undivided loyalty to Yahweh. While royal whisperers told the king exactly what he wanted to hear, these wild outsiders spoke truths that cut deep. Praying to Baal while keeping Yahweh on the side wasn't smart diplomacy. It was treason. Israel had only one God, one sacred contract, one holy destiny. And Elijah was the physical proof of this terrifying new movement. His actual name means Yahweh is my God, screaming his message before he spoke. He marched right up to Ahab and declared a total drought, attacking Baal's power over the skies. This wasn't a friendly debate about theology. This was a brutal public duel between rival gods, where the prize was food and human survival. For poor farming families in the countryside, these wild prophets spoke their deepest fears out loud. The northern kingdom had struggled with its soul ever since splitting from the temple in Jerusalem. Now, with Jezebel pushing Phoenician ways onto them, people panicked that their ancient bond with Yahweh was slipping away forever. Jezebel completely misread the religious landscape of her new home. Back in Phoenicia, multiple gods were normal, and the crown controlled the priests. She naturally expected the same setup in Israel, where rulers had always messed with the holy places. But she didn't realize that Yahweh's prophets answered to a power far higher than any palace throne. Her brutal war on these prophets was a planned, cold-blooded effort to slaughter them all, driven by political survival and her own deep faith. Looking at it through her eyes, these religious fanatics threatened her nation-building and her husband's throne. Killing them wasn't just smart politics, it was a holy duty, clearing the path for the glory of Baal. But this bloody purge backfired completely. It forced the prophets to organize. Ancient records call them the sons of the prophets, underground cells forming around radical leaders like Elijah and later Elisha. These bands kept the old stories alive, protected each other, and trained new voices. The terror meant to crush them actually gave them a backbone. Take Obadiah, a high-ranking officer in Ahab's palace, torn apart by conflicting loyalties. He secretly hid 100 prophets in dark caves, smuggling them bread and water while keeping his job in a palace that wanted them dead. His double life shows how many people were quietly resisting the queen's new religion, even while playing along on the outside. As the dust-choked land baked under Elijah's curse, tension built toward a massive collision that nobody could stop. This harsh reality pushed deep spiritual questions to the surface. Which God actually controlled the rain? Whose worship brought true abundance? Was Israel suffering for breaking its sacred covenant? Or was this just a natural disaster? The prophets had a clear, unsparing answer. Turn back to Yahweh. Throw out the foreign gods and rain will fall. This call hit home with country folks who already distrusted city ways and foreign imports. As the drought dragged on, their words carried terrifying weight. For Queen Jezebel, though the crisis pointed in a completely different direction. To her, the dry skies meant Baal needed more devotion, not less. In her mind, the only cure for a dry land was greater sacrifice, more priests, and grander rituals. She stood in direct opposition to everything Elijah stood for. With two completely different worlds colliding, war was inevitable. These rogue prophets were slipping out of royal control. They claimed direct orders from God and grew stronger each day despite fierce persecution, shaking the throne of Israel like nothing ever had before. The crown could no longer rewrite the nation's faith without facing loud, angry pushback. Political deals could no longer ignore holy laws without prophets shouting them down. A massive clash was coming. It was royal power versus a prophet's calling. Foreign gods against the ancient covenant. Jezebel's iron will against Elijah's absolute, unshakable conviction. This religious war was tied to Israel's very survival and identity. The battle of the gods was about to begin. By the third year, the ground was baked hard as iron. Rivers turned to dust and crops shriveled in the fields. Cattle starved and died. From fine palaces to dirt floor shacks, hunger and thirst burned without mercy. This was no ordinary dry spell. This was a cosmic war played out through human suffering. Elijah's dry curse struck right at the heart of Baal's claim as the great storm god. According to his followers, Baal always defeated the gods of death and drought, bringing life-giving rain to the land. But now, in the heart of Baal's territory, the skies were dead silent. That silence hung heavier than any storm cloud. To Jezebel, this crisis required an extreme holy response. Ancient discoveries show that severe droughts always sparked intense religious panic, bringing more sacrifices and elaborate rituals and desperate cries to heaven. As Baal's biggest champion, Jezebel almost certainly poured state funds into his worship, emptying the royal vaults to pay for more priests and offerings. Scripture mentions 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asher feeding at her table, proving she sponsored this movement on a massive scale. These were no street preachers, but an elite priesthood paid for by the state. Their presence was a planned attempt to replace the ancient worship of Yahweh with Phoenician gods. Archaeologists have found physical proof of this dramatic religious shift. They have dug up pagan altars, sacred poles, and ritual objects scattered throughout Israelite towns from this exact era. Many families kept tiny shrines at home, placing statues of Baal next to symbols of Yahweh, a double-minded faith the prophets absolutely hated. Ruins also reveal grand temples built in Samaria following Phoenician blueprints, completely ignoring the traditional style of the Jerusalem temple. These massive pagan temples towered over the cities, making Baal worship look normal, official, and far grander than any sanctuary for Yahweh. Polished stone, expensive cedar, and gold trimmings showed everyone that the king and queen fully backed these new gods. For regular folks, this environment forced painful choices every single day. Did they walk past Baal's temple, or take a long detour? Did they join the pagan feasts, or risk looking like traitors to the crown? Should they stick to Yahweh alone, or play it safe and pray to the storm god for rain? This was not some classroom debate. It was a matter of survival, affecting their jobs, their social standing, and often their very lives. Country villages held tight to the old ways. while city crowds quickly adopted the trendy new foreign customs. This split created a massive divide between rich, worldly city elites and the simple farmers who guarded their ancestors' faith. Faith split the nation, tearing families and neighbors apart. From the shadows, Elijah watched and waited. The story tells us he hid first at the Kirthbrook, then found shelter with a poor widow in Zarephath, ironically hiding deep inside Phoenician territory, right where Jezebel's guards would never think to look. These quiet years were a time of preparation, not hiding. Fed by ravens and surviving on a never-ending jar of oil, Elijah saw Yahweh's power rule even in the heart of Baal's land. When God finally told him to go back, Elijah first tracked down Obadiah, a high-ranking palace official who secretly protected Yahweh's followers. Their tense meeting shows how terrified everyone was of the crown. Obadiah was terrified to tell King Ahab that Elijah was back, fearing the prophet would disappear again and leave him to face royal fury. Only after a sacred promise did he set up the meeting. When the king and the prophet met, the air crackled. Ahab sneered, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" He blamed the prophet for all of Israel's misery. But Elijah didn't flinch, throwing the accusation right back. "I have not brought ruin to Israel. Did you and your father's family by abandoning the commands of Yahweh to follow Baal?" That clash laid bare their rival worlds. For Ahab, the prophet's words had triggered the drought, pinning years of national misery on a single man. But Elijah saw it differently. The cracked earth was just the inevitable result of the palace betraying their God. One saw a dangerous rebel. The other knew he carried a divine spark. What happened next would echo through history. Elijah dared the prophets of Baal to a public showdown on Mount Carmel. This was no academic debate. It was a lethal trial with lives on the line. Before a desperate crowd of Israelites, the ultimate question hung in the air. Which God truly ruled the skies? Whose altar brought life-giving rain? Which path would define the nation? Then Elijah delivered his challenge with devastating force. "How long will you waver between two opinions? If Yahweh is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him." He shattered the comfortable compromise so many had secretly made. There was no middle ground anymore. They had to choose a side. No more playing both sides. It was all or nothing now. Brimming with confidence, the prophets of Baal stepped forward. They were sure their God would answer. From dawn until noon, they shrieked and danced around their altar, but only silence answered. Elijah mocked them. Maybe their God was busy, or traveling, or asleep and needed waking. His taunts turned their panic into pure humiliation. By late afternoon, they were slashing themselves with knives and spears. Blood flowed onto the dirt. They begged for even a whisper of attention. Then it was Elijah's turn. Moving deliberately, he rebuilt the broken altar of Yahweh, using 12 heavy stones for the reconstruction. One stone for each tribe of Israel, linking their current crisis to their ancient roots. Around the altar, he dug a deep trench. He laid the wood and the sacrifice in place. Then, in a land dried by 3 years of drought, he demanded water. 4 large jars were poured over everything, then 4 more and 4 more again until the trench ran full. When he finally prayed, his words were quiet and direct. He used no magical chants, only a plea of covenant faith. "Answer me, Yahweh, answer, so this people will know you are God." Then came the fire. It was a searing roar of heat that ate the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the dust. It licked up every drop of water in the trench. The crowd fell flat on their faces, shouting that Yahweh alone is God. Instantly, Elijah ordered the prophets of Baal seized. He had them executed in the Kishon Valley, a brutal act, but decisive back then. It was the ancient penalty for false prophets, and it broke Jezebel's grip on power in one stroke. Then dark clouds gathered on the horizon. The 3-year drought broke. Rain poured. Filled with wild energy, Elijah outran Ahab's chariot all the way to Jezreel. The war seemed over. Yahweh ruled the storms, not Baal. One God had answered with fire, while the other remained dead silent. Elijah proved his power. The priests were dead, but one person remained unmoved. When Jezebel heard of her slaughtered priests, she did not flinch. Instead, a cold, furious resolve took hold of her. The war for Israel's soul was starting. Then began the Queen's Purge. Quiet corridors in Samaria now echoed with terrified whispers. Jezebel was done sharing power with the followers of Yahweh. Any trace of tolerance had vanished from her heart. She focused entirely on reshaping the land in her own image. Under the hot sun, royal guards marched through dusty villages carrying lists of targeted names. The men and women they hunted were no criminals. They were prophets of Yahweh, now branded as traitors to the crown. The queen poured massive wealth into building grand temples across the north, their white stone walls rising like monuments to her absolute rule. Inside, foreign priests and priestesses of Asher performed rituals that filled traditional Israelites with deep unease. Sweet-smelling incense drifted from the altars, comforting to some, but terrifying to others. People whispered that their old ways were slowly dying. Mothers held their children tight near the new shrines, warning them that the foreign queen wanted to erase their heritage. From her high palace, Jezebel ordered a systematic purge. Any prophet who refused to bow to Baal vanished into the dark night. Many fled to deep caves, living off dry scraps smuggled by brave villagers. The less fortunate never got the chance to run. Obadiah, a high official, secretly loyal to Yahweh, risked his life to hide 100 prophets in 2 remote caves. He smuggled bread and water to them under the cover of night. His hands shook at the palace gates, wondering if this step would lead to his death. Meanwhile, the queen's influence corrupted the royal court. Ambitious nobles eagerly adopted Phoenician fashion language and pagan rituals to win her favor. They spoke her foreign language and decorated their homes with icons of Baal. Survival and ambition were now tied to this cultural shift. Out in the countryside, ordinary families made silent choices. Many buried small altars to Yahweh beneath their dirt floors. Others gave in. The risk was simply too high. Families fractured along the invisible lines of belief. Yet Jezebel acted out of genuine belief, not just cold politics. She truly thought she was bringing modern culture to a backward, stubborn nation. The deities that built Phoenicia's wealth could do the same for Israel. To her, this forced transition was a gift to her new home. As seasons passed, the voice of Yahweh faded from the land. His prophets were silenced, whispering only in the deep shadows. The queen's purge had achieved almost everything she wanted. For now at least, Baal's thunder seemed to drown out Yahweh's whisper, leading to Mount Carmel and the fire. Heavy clouds hung over Mount Carmel, hinting at the clash gathering on its slopes. After years spent hiding in silence, one man decided it was finally time for a divine showdown. Elijah the Tishbite, wild-haired and wearing rough leather, sent a message to King Ahab. "Meet me on Mount Carmel and bring your prophets with you." The drought had dragged on for 3 long years now. Fields were cracked and barren. Children went to sleep hungry night after night. Even the rich felt the sting of empty barns. Many blamed this terrible suffering on those who had turned away from Yahweh. Elijah used that anger to set up his big challenge. "How long will you waver between 2 opinions?" he shouted to the massive crowd. His voice echoed across the peak, where hundreds had gathered to watch. "If Yahweh is God, then follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." The crowd stood frozen, torn between terror of the queen and a quiet, burning curiosity about what would happen next. Ahab watched from a shaded canopy, showing no emotion. Runners had been sent to tell Jezebel, but she chose to remain in her palace, maybe sensing a trap. Elijah set the rules. 2 altars, 2 sacrificial bulls, but absolutely no human fire. Each side would pray for their own god to send down flame from heaven. Whichever god answered with fire would be the true God of Israel. The prophets of Baal stepped up first. 450 men danced around their altar from morning until noon, shouting to their god, "Baal, answer us!" As the empty hours crawled by, their dancing grew frantic. They slashed themselves with swords and spears until blood mixed with sweat on the dry dirt. "Maybe your God is fast asleep," Elijah mocked. "Shout louder!" His mocking words cut deep, but they kept screaming until evening, their voices completely ruined and their bodies broken. As the sun began to set, Elijah stepped forward. He repaired a broken altar of Yahweh, using 12 stones, 1 for each tribe of Israel, then dug a deep trench around it. He laid out the wood, placed the offering on top, and called for water. In a parched land, wasting water like this seemed reckless, almost offensive. Yet 4 massive jars of water were poured over the offering, then 4 more, then another 4 until the trench was completely flooded. As evening painted the sky in deep purples and dark blues, Elijah raised his hands. "Yahweh, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," he prayed. His voice sounded calm and steady in the heavy silence. "Show them today that you are God in Israel." Suddenly, fire fell from heaven. It was no tiny spark, but a roaring blaze, so intense it devoured the offering, the wood, the very stones, and licked up all the water. The people dropped to their knees, pressing their faces into the dirt. "Yahweh is God!" they screamed. "Yahweh is God!" What happened next would change the kingdom forever. Elijah, fueled by this absolute victory, ordered the crowd to grab the prophets of Baal. 450 men were dragged to the valley and executed. Their blood pooled in the dry riverbed, a brutal and crimson sign of extreme religious devotion pushed to its absolute limit. As heavy rain clouds finally rolled across the horizon, riders galloped towards Samaria with news Jezebel would find impossible to believe. The entire priesthood she had built was gone, wiped out by one man and a terrifying flash of power. Dawn eventually broke, painting Samaria's limestone walls in soft pink. Yet inside the palace, a darker storm was brewing. Jezebel stood perfectly still as the messenger delivered the grim news from Mount Carmel. Her priests were dead, her gods had been humiliated, her royal power had been openly defied in front of the entire nation. Her closest servants backed away, terrified of the quiet, icy stillness that had taken over her. This was not the silence of defeat. It was a cold, calculating rage that does not quickly fade, but sits and waits. "Well," she whispered at last, her voice barely louder than a breath, "so this prophet thinks he has won." She walked to the window, looking over the capital she had built. 3 long years of drought had ended with Elijah's triumph, and rain washed her adopted city. The crowds would see this as Yahweh's favor. Staring out into the downpour, she dictated a message to be sent to Elijah immediately. "May the gods strike me dead if by this time tomorrow I have not ended your life, just like you ended theirs." This was no empty threat. It was a binding, sacred oath. By invoking her gods, Jezebel sealed her own fate to this task. The terrified messenger did not dare question her. Within the hour, horses were galloping out of Samaria with her promise of death. When Elijah got the message, something unbelievable happened. This was the prophet who had just defied 450 priests of Baal, who had called down fire from heaven and ordered a mass execution without blinking. Yet this same warrior turned and ran. One angry woman's threat did what no army could do. He fled south, escaping the borders of Israel and Judah, running deep into the barren wilderness. Collapsing under a lone desert bush, totally broken and exhausted, he begged to die. "I have had enough, Yahweh," he prayed. "Take my life." Back in Samaria, Jezebel unleashed her spies. Every dusty road was guarded, every village questioned. She was determined to hunt down the man who had disgraced her, the man who ruined her years of political and religious planning in one single afternoon. For ordinary families in Israel, the struggle now felt much deeper. It was no longer just a feud between a queen and a wild prophet. It challenged the very nature of power and truth. Could a foreign-born queen force her gods onto an entire nation? Could one solitary prophet stand against the crushing weight of the throne, whose deity would shape the future of the nation? In neighboring royal courts, rulers whispered about the heavy drama unfolding in Israel. Some shrugged it off as simple religious fighting. Others saw the political danger clearly. After all, a ruler whose divine authority was shattered might soon face rebellion in every other part of their kingdom. As days dragged into weeks, Elijah kept running, shielded by a quiet grace, all the way to Mount Horeb, deep in the south. In the deep quiet, after the wind, the earthquake, and the fire, he heard a gentle whisper. It gave him direction. Back home, Queen Jezebel knew this war was far from over. Elijah was gone, but his dramatic victory on Mount Carmel had sparked a fresh, deep faith among the people. Her vow to kill him remained unpaid, a debt she fully meant to collect. Outside the walls of Jezreel, near the king's winter palace, lay a lush vineyard. It belonged to a man named Naboth. These were not ordinary vines. His family had tended them for generations, passing the land down as a sacred, irreplaceable heritage. King Ahab grew obsessed with this plot. From his high palace window, he watched those neat green rows daily. He admired the neat channels and the dark, rich soil. One afternoon, he thought to himself that the land would make a perfect vegetable garden. It was so close to his walls. The king approached Naboth with a proposal he believed was more than fair. "Sell me the vineyard." He offered a better plot elsewhere, or full cash value. But Naboth refused, saying Yahweh forbade him from selling the inheritance of his ancestors. It was not about stubbornness or greed. To an Israelite family, land was a sacred trust from God, tied directly to their identity. Selling it would betray his family and his faith. So Ahab crawled back to his palace, sulking like a spoiled child. He threw himself on his bed, turned his face to the wall, and refused to eat, humiliated by a commoner. When Jezebel found him weeping and learned why, she was utterly disgusted by his weakness. She asked him with deep contempt if this was how the king of Israel behaved. She told him to eat and cheer up. She would get the vineyard. Using the royal seal, she sent letters to Jezreel's elders. Her scheme was brilliantly cruel. Declare a religious fast, put Naboth in a place of honor before the crowd, and hire 2 worthless liars to publicly accuse him of cursing both God and the king. The city officials, eager to please the ruthless queen, carried out her orders without question. Under the mask of religion, they set a trap for Naboth. The day arrived. The false charges were read. Paid liars swore to them. Soon the crowd grew angry, smelling blood. There was no trial, no defense, and no mercy, just heavy stones crushing the life out of Naboth. Quickly, word reached the palace that Naboth was dead. Jezebel broke the news with chilling indifference. She told Ahab to go claim his vineyard, since Naboth was no longer alive to refuse him. Ahab jumped up, his self-pity instantly forgotten. He hurried down to the plot, already planning exactly where his new garden would grow. But as he walked the neat rows Naboth had tended so lovingly, he missed the lone figure walking down from the hills. Elijah was back, sent by God to confront the king yet again. Their clash among those stolen vines would never be forgotten. Ahab gasped, "Have you found me, my enemy?" The prophet answered, "Yes, I have found you, because you have sold your soul to do what is evil before Yahweh." Then came a curse that would haunt the royal family forever. Where dogs licked up Naboth's blood, dogs will lick yours too. And for Jezebel, the prophet promised an even more horrific end. Wild dogs will eat Jezebel by the walls of Jezreel. What made this crime so terrifying was not just the murder, but how she did it. Jezebel worked entirely within the accepted religious laws and legal structures of Israel. A holy fast, a grand public trial that required 2 witnesses. She did not just break the law, she weaponized it. For everyday people, the Naboth's vineyard became a symbol of corrupt power crushing justice. Farmers whispered about it in their fields, and elders passed the warning down to their children. Even foreign courts heard how Israel's king had crossed the line. But soon, the focus shifted back to war. 3 years went by after that confrontation in the vineyard. Elijah lived like a ghost, slipping through the land like a shadow, appearing out of nowhere with warnings from God, then vanishing. People spoke his name with a mix of awe and terror. When he emerged again, Israel was bracing for battle. King Ben-Hadad of Aram was gathering a massive army along the northern border. Despite his many sins, Ahab was a sharp military commander. Inside his war room, he quickly organized a strategic defense. Officers debated tactics, while scouts rushed in with reports. Suddenly, an unknown prophet stepped into the tense room. He was not Elijah, but one of the hidden prophets, now stepping into the light as Jezebel's power began to fade. Even though her grip on the family remained tight, the prophet announced that Yahweh would deliver this massive enemy army into Ahab's hands that very day. This was so Ahab would know Yahweh is God. The king, always practical, asked who would lead the attack. The prophet answered, the young officers of the governors. Ahab trusted this unusual strategy, sending 232 young officers ahead of 7,000 troops. Against all odds, Israel won a shocking victory. Ben-Hadad barely escaped on horseback with just a handful of his men, leaving his forces shattered across the hills. But the prophet warned Ahab to build up his defenses and plan carefully, because when spring came, the king of Aram would attack again. In Damascus, Ben-Hadad's advisors tried to explain the defeat, claiming Israel's gods were only gods of the hills. That was why Israel was too strong, but if they fought them in the open valleys, they would surely win next time. When spring came, the armies gathered on the flat plains near Afk. Israel's forces looked like 2 tiny flocks of goats, dwarfed by an Aramean army that seemed to cover the entire earth. Yet victory went to Ahab's men again. 100,000 Aramean infantry fell in a single day, forcing Ben-Hadad to surrender. Instead of executing his enemy, Ahab welcomed him like a brother and made a treaty. Cities were returned, and Israelite merchants entered Damascus. To many, this seemed like brilliant diplomacy, but not to those speaking for Yahweh. They saw the alliance as a gutless compromise. It was just another case of Ahab placing political convenience above divine commands. To prove this, a prophet disguised himself on the road back. He confronted Ahab directly with a warning from Yahweh. You spared a doomed man. Now your life pays for his life, your people for his. Ahab returned to Samaria, bitter and angry. His victory felt completely hollow now. Despite everything his forces had achieved, the king could not escape the shadow of judgment that followed his every move. For Jezebel, these repeated spiritual interventions in warfare threatened everything she had built. Victories credited to Yahweh only breathed new life into the faithful Hebrews she had worked so hard to crush. Her husband was increasingly torn between her advice and the warnings of prophets who kept appearing despite her best efforts. Out in the markets, in the villages, regular folks whispered Yahweh's name again. They retold stories of Carmel's fire and impossible victories. A shift was happening. A quiet revival of ancient faith was rising up against foreign ways. Elijah watched this from afar while training Elisha. The old prophet knew his own chapter was drawing to a close. New voices would rise to carry the torch. Then came the sudden arrow in the chariot. Rumors of a new war reached Samaria. This threat was not from Aram, but from the rising power of Assyria marching from the east. Ahab, always the pragmatist, forged a quick alliance with his old enemy Ben-Hadad and with King Jehoshaphat of Judah to face this common threat. But before marching, Jehoshaphat, devoted to Yahweh, insisted they seek divine counsel first. Ahab summoned his 400 court prophets, men who had learned to toss around Yahweh's name while still telling the king exactly what he wanted to hear. "Go," they shouted together, "for Yahweh will surely hand victory to the king." But there was an eagerness in their chorus that made Jehoshaphat uneasy. "Is there not a real prophet of Yahweh we can consult?" Ahab's face darkened. "There is still one man through whom we can seek the Lord. But I hate him because he never predicts anything good for me, only disaster. His name is Micaiah, son of Imlah." While guards ran to fetch Micaiah, a prophet named Zedekiah made iron horns, parading around and shouting that Ahab would gore the Arameans until they were destroyed. The other court prophets cheered wildly. Meanwhile, the runner warned Micaiah to fall in line and make sure his message matched the others. His reply showed true integrity in those dark days. "As surely as Yahweh lives, I will speak only what Yahweh tells me." Brought before the kings, Micaiah first just repeated the court prophets. But his voice dripped with such sarcasm that Ahab snapped, demanding to know how many times he had to order him to speak only the truth in Yahweh's name. Then Micaiah turned deadly serious. He described a vision where Yahweh allowed a lying spirit to influence the court prophets, baiting Ahab to his doom. His real warning was completely clear. Disaster, absolute disaster, was waiting for the king on that battlefield. For speaking this harsh truth, Micaiah was slapped across the face and thrown into a cell. Zedekiah, the prophet with iron horns, mocked him openly. He demanded to know which way Yahweh's spirit went when leaving him to speak to Micaiah. "You will find out," Micaiah answered, "on the day you run to find a secret room to hide," forecasting the terrible reckoning that would come for false prophets. Yet Ahab still prepared for battle. Mixing superstition with desperate strategy, he decided to fight disguised as an ordinary soldier while asking Jehoshaphat to wear his full royal robes. Maybe he hoped to dodge both enemy archers and divine judgment. Soon the fields of Ramoth-Gilead turned into a swirling chaos of chariots, horses, and infantry. The king of Aram had ordered his captains to fight absolutely no one except Ahab of Israel. They chased Jehoshaphat, mistaking him for Ahab, before realizing their error and turning back. Amidst the swirling combat, an Aramean soldier drew back his bow and let fly a single arrow into the crowd without aiming. That random shot found a tiny gap where the plates of Ahab's armor met. Propped up in his chariot, the wounded king stayed standing, staring out at the enemy lines as blood pooled at his feet. By sunset, the king was dead. When they brought his body back to Samaria, servants washed his blood-soaked chariot in a pool where prostitutes bathed, and stray dogs licked up the water turned red with royal blood. Elijah's curse, declared years ago in Naboth's stolen vineyard after that brutal murder, had finally come to pass. For Jezebel, Ahab's death changed everything. Her power now depended on her sons rather than her husband. As queen mother, she still held massive political sway in Israel, especially with her eldest son Ahaziah on the throne, a young king cut from the exact same cloth. Throughout Israel, the news of his death and all that followed, the failed disguise, the random arrow, and the dogs licking up his blood, spread quickly. It all confirmed what the prophets had warned from the start. No one, not even a king, can escape divine justice forever. And yet, even as the body of her husband was lowered into the dark tomb, Jezebel refused to see his death as anything but raw coincidence or the brutal, unpredictable fortune of war. In her eyes, her gods were still powerful. Her long mission to reshape Israel remained unfinished. Her next chapter would be defined not as a wife, but as a mother to kings and rulers. Ahaziah, her eldest son with Ahab, took the Sumerian throne amid whispers of deep uncertainty. He came to power while the nation still reeled from the sudden loss of his father. Everyone wondered, would the young son follow the bloody path his father had walked? Courtiers watched closely for any sign of who would truly guide the new king, and the answer came quickly. Ahaziah soon made it clear that he was indeed the son of his mother. He embraced the heavy devotion to Baal that had defined the reign of his parents. The temples Jezebel built stayed crowded and active, and her pagan priests kept their immense power. In fact, the young monarch seemed even more devoted to Phoenician religious practices than his father had ever been. For Jezebel, this felt like a sweet restoration of her power. No longer was she just a foreign princess brought in to secure a simple political alliance. She now held the highly respected title of Queen Mother. From her private chambers, she carefully guided her son through complex matters of state and religion. Whispers in the corridors claimed that no royal decree went out without her personal stamp of approval. Down south in Judah, King Jehoshaphat watched these events with growing concern. His own land remained loyal to the worship of Yahweh, which drove a deep spiritual and cultural wedge between the two sister nations that only grew wider each year. Still, the hard realities of sharing a border and facing common enemies forced them to work together despite their religious divides. But the reign of Ahaziah proved tragically short. While walking through an upper chamber of his palace, he fell right through a fragile lattice window. The terrible fall left him severely injured, bedridden, and fearing for his life. In constant agony, the panicked king sent messengers to seek answers from Baal-zebub. He wanted the god of Ekron to tell him if he would live. On the road, the messengers were stopped by Elijah, the aged prophet. His skin was weathered from decades in the harsh wilderness, and his warning was sharp. "Is it because there is no God in Israel that you go to consult Baal-zebub?" The prophet declared that the king would never leave his sickbed and would surely die. When the messengers returned and described the mysterious stranger, Ahaziah knew instantly it was Elijah. Even in his weakened state, the angry king sent troops to arrest the prophet, but twice, a captain and 50 soldiers were instantly consumed by fire falling from heaven. A third captain fell to his knees, begging the prophet to spare his life and the lives of his men. Moving with mercy, Elijah went with him to face the dying ruler. Shortly after Ahaziah died without a son to succeed him, his reign cut short after just 2 years. The crown then went to his brother Joram, sometimes called Jehoram. This sudden shift in power offered a glimmer of hope. Would the second son of Jezebel choose a different path? Those hoping for reform saw early encouraging signs. The ancient texts record that Joram did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, but he did not go as far as his mother and father. He actually tore down the sacred pillar of Baal that Ahab had built. This partial reform, which removed some pagan idols while leaving other dark elements of foreign worship, suggested a young leader torn by deep inner conflict. Perhaps he saw the political value in keeping the followers of Yahweh quiet without actually adopting their beliefs. Or maybe he truly wanted a middle ground between the devotion of his mother and the ancient faith of Israel. To Jezebel, these choices by her son must have looked like a weak, disappointing compromise. The very idols she had spent years planting across Israel were now being uprooted by her own flesh and blood. Yet she kept her influence, adapting her methods to fit these challenging new realities. It was during this uneasy period that the ministry of Elijah drew to its close. In one of the most mysterious scenes in all of ancient scripture, he was swept up to heaven in a roaring whirlwind with only his student Elisha watching. The physical mantle of prophetic power fell from the sky straight to Elisha, who would now lead the spiritual battle against the enduring influence of Jezebel. Meanwhile, the reign of Joram faced constant military pressure from invading forces outside his borders. Moab had stopped paying tribute to Israel after the death of Ahab, so Joram built a strong alliance with Jehoshaphat of Judah and the king of Edom to crush the rebellion. But when the joint armies ran out of water deep in the dry wasteland, they sought out Elisha. The response of the prophet showed exactly what he thought of King Joram. He asked him, "What do we have in common? Go instead to the prophets of your father and of your mother." Only because he respected Jehoshaphat did Elisha agree to help, giving them guidance that saved the entire army from certain doom. The dramatic moment made it clear that the deep spiritual rift in the palace still remained. Joram stood caught between two worlds, the paganism of his parents and the pure worship of Yahweh that Elisha championed. His middle ground pleased absolutely no one, and it would soon prove impossible to maintain. All through those tense years, Jezebel remained a powerful presence in the court, even if she stayed mostly in the shadows. Her direct control had faded, but her influence still guided her son from behind the scenes, and those who still clung to her vision. She watched with rising worry as the power of the prophets grew, challenging the very limits of royal authority once again. With the legacy of Elijah and the rise of Elisha, a different kind of prophet now walked the dusty roads of Israel. While Elijah had been all fire and direct clashes with kings, Elisha walked quietly among the common folk. His miracles usually touched the simple, everyday struggles of the poor, making bad water clean, feeding starving families, and even bringing a dead child back to life. This shift in his ministry did not mean he lacked strength, just that his power was focused differently. After the extraordinary departure of Elijah in the whirlwind, amazing stories of the new prophet swept through the villages. Families whispered of the miraculous jar of oil that never dried up, saving the children of a poor widow from debt collectors. Local farmers spoke of a heavy iron axe head that defied nature and floated on water. Travelers shared tales of a pot of poison stew made completely safe with just a handful of flour. These wonders were not performed for entertainment. Every single miracle carried a profound message. Yahweh looked at the ordinary person. He cared about justice and the daily struggle about lives the powerful so easily overlooked. Perhaps the most consequential of his acts was Elisha healing Naaman, the commander of Aram's army. This foreign military leader, suffering from leprosy, found his healing by washing 7 times in the Jordan River. Elisha told him to do it, though he expected something far more dramatic. When Naaman pressed rich gifts on the prophet, Elisha refused them flat out, making it clear that divine healing was never a commodity up for sale. Gehazi, Elisha's own servant, could not resist. He slipped away in secret, approaching Naaman privately, lying that Elisha had changed his mind and would accept some gifts after all. His punishment was the very leprosy from which Naaman had just been cured. A heavy, terrifying lesson on what greed and lies cost the soul. All of this unfolded while Jezebel still ruled from the palace, pulling the strings through her son Joram. The contrast between the two could not be sharper. A queen using royal power to force her religion down from the throne onto a nation, and a prophet building a movement from below, one miracle at a time, one village at a time. In many ways, Elisha posed an even deeper threat to Jezebel than Elijah ever did. Elijah had fought power directly, sparking loud confrontations that could be stopped by silencing just one man. But Elisha wove Yahweh's worship into the daily life of countless small communities, building a movement far too scattered to be crushed by targeting any single leader. The schools of prophets Elisha set up across Israel became pockets of resistance to Baal worship and royal overreach. Young men trained in these places carried Yahweh's covenant message into every corner of the kingdom. What had once been a small band of prophets hiding in caves during Jezebel's purge was now a resilient, organized spiritual force. Jezebel saw the threat clearly from her chambers in Samaria and Jezreel. She watched this growing movement with deep anxiety. Her son Joram had already bent removing some of the Baal symbols. Now, ordinary people looked to Elisha rather than the crown for help and leadership. Soon, unsettling reports reached the palace of the prophet's uncanny ability to recount in sharp detail secrets whispered in the deep privacy of the king of Aram's own bedroom, ruining planned attacks before they could even start. Another story reached the palace about a time the prophet was completely surrounded by an enemy army sent specifically to capture him. When his servant panicked at the sight of the surrounding troops, Elisha prayed that the young man's eyes would be opened. He looked up and saw the hills filled with horses and chariots of fire, a massive heavenly army. This was no longer just a spiritual clash. It was a fight for the very soul of the nation. Would Israel mimic its neighbors, letting kings decide how they worshipped? Or would prophets demanding justice and mercy and faithfulness to Yahweh win the struggle? Regardless of royal decrees, Joram was torn between these worlds. His mother stood for one path, Elisha stood for the other. Joram's weak compromises pleased nobody, leaving him exposed to pressure from both sides. For Jezebel, old now, but still fierce, these years brought a bitter frustration. The religious shift she envisioned for Israel was never finished. Her influence, though still strong, clashed with a prophetic movement that refused to back down or fade away. What neither Jezebel nor Joram saw was that Elisha's quiet movement was about to step straight into politics. The prophet who spent years helping ordinary people was now preparing to strike at the heart of royal power. The whisper of a coming coup. Safe from palace spies and court games, Elisha called in a young prophet from his circle of followers. The room smelled of oil and herbs as Elisha handed him a small flask. It looked ordinary enough, but it held a heavy, dangerous purpose. "Hide this flask under your cloak," Elisha whispered, his voice steady. "Travel to Ramoth-Gilead. Find Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat, son of Nimshi." This Jehu was no random choice. He was a commander under both Ahab and Joram. He was famous across the army for a wild boldness that bordered on madness. "He drives like Jehu," they said, whenever a chariot driver pushed his horses past their breaking point. Elisha gave his final heavy instructions: get him away from the other officers and take him inside a private room. Pour the oil on his head and tell him this is Yahweh's word. I anoint you king over Israel. This was no simple ritual. It was treason. Joram still sat on the throne, and anointing another meant sparking a bloody civil war, a danger that did not seem to trouble Elisha at all. "Open the door and run," Elisha warned, knowing the deadly danger of the task. The young prophet left immediately for Ramoth-Gilead, where Israel's army stood guard against Aram. He found Jehu sitting with his fellow officers, perhaps planning strategy or killing time. "I have a message for you, Commander," the young man said. "For which of us?" Jehu asked. "For you, Commander." In a quiet room, the prophet tipped the flask, letting the cool oil run down over Jehu's head and soak into his beard. "This is the message from Yahweh, God of Israel," the prophet declared. I anoint you king over Yahweh's people. You must destroy the family of Ahab your master. I will avenge the blood of my prophets and every servant of Yahweh slaughtered by Jezebel." He delivered a grim, chilling warning about wiping out Ahab's line, ending with the specific doom waiting for Jezebel. Dogs will eat Jezebel on the ground at Jezreel, and nobody will bury her. With his task finished, the young prophet threw open the door and bolted. He left Jehu standing in the sudden quiet, holding a choice that would break a kingdom. Would he accept this dangerous call or ignore it? Or would he just brush it off as the wild talk of a madman, like his fellow soldiers were about to suggest? When Jehu walked back to them, they saw it instantly. "Why did that crazy fellow come to you?" they pressed. "You know how those prophets talk." Jehu tried to play it down at first. "You know how men like that are," he said, but they didn't buy it. "Tell us the truth," they demanded. Finally, Jehu cracked. He told them that Yahweh had spoken. "The Lord anoints you king over Israel." What happened next showed just how much the army hated Joram's rule and how sick they were of Jezebel's dark influence on the throne. Instead of reporting this treason to their king, the officers accepted Jehu as their new leader right then and there. They flung their heavy cloaks onto the stone steps under his feet, making a rough, dusty red carpet. A horn blasted through the outpost, and soldiers began to shout, "Jehu is king!" The first cold breeze of rebellion had begun to blow. Out in a dusty border town, far from the queen's spies, a rebel king was born. The sacred oil was still wet on Jehu's forehead, but the gears of a bloody coup were already turning. Jehu moved with the ruthless speed he was famous for. "If you really want me as king," he told the men around him, "make sure no one slips out of the gates to warn Jezreel." They locked up the city, while Jehu prepared his war chariots for the ride that would shatter Israel. Back in the palace at Jezreel, Jezebel and Joram had no idea a storm was coming. The rebellion at Ramoth-Gilead threatened everything the queen had built over 40 years. It meant the rise of Yahweh's followers and the sudden end of her own religious empire. Worse, it was a direct strike at her own family line. The spark of prophecy that Elijah had kindled was about to become a wildfire, tearing through the whole land of Israel. It would bring ruin to Ahab's family and to the queen who had dared to stand against God. But for the moment, the secret stayed locked with the soldiers who were quietly preparing to march against their king. Jehu's ride was about to begin. The royal court of Israel had absolutely no warning. Miles away from the throne, a quiet meeting was taking place, one that held the weight of the entire nation's future. Elisha the prophet, who succeeded Elijah, sent a young apprentice with a jar of oil to find a tough military commander named Jehu. The young messenger found him sitting with his fellow officers. "I have a message for you, Commander," the young prophet said. He pulled Jehu into a back room where they could be alone. There, he emptied the jar of oil over Jehu's head, marking him as Israel's next king. The words that followed must have felt like ice water to Jehu. "The Lord says, I anoint you king over Israel. You will destroy the family of Ahab. I will avenge the blood of my prophets slain by Jezebel." The moment the words were out, the young man turned and bolted. He left Jehu behind to face his officers and their intense curiosity. When they demanded to know what the crazy visitor wanted, Jehu tried to shrug it off, but they kept pushing until he finally told them. He had been anointed king. Instantly, the air in the room shifted. These rough, battle-hardened soldiers knew a turning point when they saw one. They tore off their outer cloaks and threw them under Jehu's feet, throwing together a makeshift royal carpet out of fabric and sheer adrenaline. They blew their military horns and shouted, "Jehu is king!" The rebellion was born, but every second mattered now. If news reached Jezreel before Jehu did, they were dead. Messengers would warn the palace, and the palace guards would seal the walls. Their only real weapon was surprise, and it would vanish like fog under a hot sun. So Jehu ordered that no one leave the camp. Then he climbed onto his chariot. The leather reins felt different in his hands now. These were the hands of a king, not just a general. His horses felt the panic and leaped forward, galloping toward Jezreel, where Jezebel and Joram rested, totally blind to the threat. The ancient text says Jehu drove furiously. Picture the horizon. Huge clouds of red dust rising behind a fleet of rushing war chariots. The thunder of hooves, the scream of wooden wheels pushed to their breaking point. Jehu's face was like flint, his eyes locked on the road ahead. This wasn't a standard march. It was judgment hurtling forward. High on the tower of Jezreel, a sentry caught sight of the cloud of dust coming down the valley. It started as a pale mist, then resolved into horses and iron chariots moving fast, heading straight for the city. King Joram, still healing from wounds he got fighting the Arameans, sent a scout to meet them. "Is everything peaceful?" the messenger shouted. It was the standard greeting of the day, but it hung heavy in the air. Jehu's response tore away any hope of safety. "How can there be peace?" he barked, "while your mother Jezebel keeps on with her pagan worship and dark magic?" The rider never went back. Joram sent a second messenger in a panic, but he didn't return either. Both riders simply fell in behind Jehu, joining the army racing toward the palace. Up on the wall, the sentry must have felt cold dread as he yelled down to the king. Something was terribly wrong, and in the distance, the street dogs had begun to howl. The fall of Joram. The morning sun lit up the stone walls of Jezreel as two royal chariots rolled out of the city gates. Joram, the king of Israel and son of Jezebel, rode in the first. Beside him was his cousin, King Ahaziah of Judah, who had come to visit his wounded relative. Two princes heirs to mighty thrones rode side by side to meet the coming dust cloud. They met Jehu right at the edge of Nebaioth's old vineyard. This was the exact plot of land Jezebel had stolen through lies and murder years ago. The dirt that had swallowed an innocent man's blood was about to drink again. Destiny has a cold way of coming full circle. "Is it peace?" Joram shouted, repeating the same question his lost scouts had asked. Jehu's answer fell over them like the ash of a burning house. "What peace can there be," he said, "while your mother Jezebel continues her endless idolatry and dark sorcery?" In that single breath, Joram understood everything.
"Treachery!" he screamed, whipping his chariot around to flee. But his warning to Ahaziah came a moment too late. Jehu, whose very name means Yahweh is he, drew back his bow with dead-eye focus. The arrow tore straight through the air, striking Joram between the shoulder blades and piercing his heart. The king of Israel slumped forward in his chariot, his blood pooling on the floorboards. "Take him and dump him in Naboth's field," Jehu ordered his officer Bidkar. "Remember when you and I rode side by side behind his father Ahab, and the Lord handed down this exact sentence against him?
Surely I saw the blood of Naboth and his sons yesterday, and I will collect that debt on this very ground." So they threw Joram's corpse onto the soil his mother had stolen through crooked trials. Justice came full circle, a bitter irony even Jehu couldn't miss. The very plot of land Jezebel had stolen, by bending the law to her will, now swallowed the body of her own son. King Ahaziah of Judah, watching his cousin die right before his eyes, fled in terror. Jehu's men hunted him down, wounding him as he drove. He managed to escape to nearby Megiddo, but the bleeding wouldn't stop. With Joram dead, the royal house of Ahab was collapsing, piece by piece. Nothing stood between Jehu and Jezreel now but the city gates and the queen mother waiting behind them. Word of her son's death would find her soon enough, riding the same wind that kicked up dust behind Jehu's charging chariots. The ancient wheels of prophecy set in motion years ago by Elijah on Mount Carmel were spinning now with terrifying speed. More blood was coming, and the street dogs of Jezreel were already growing restless, as if they could smell the feast promised by the prophets. Then came Jezebel's final hour. When news reached the palace that Joram was dead, she did something unexpected. Jezebel, an aging queen mother who had survived decades of political bloodbaths, refused to run. She didn't hide in the dark corners of her palace or beg for her life. Instead, she got ready for one last show of defiance. She painted her eyes with dark kohl, a royal look dating back to ancient Egypt. She carefully styled her hair and dressed herself in her finest queenly robes. Some historians believe she dressed in her full royal garments, perhaps even her sacred Sidonian priestess robes. This wasn't a vain woman desperately clinging to her beauty as death closed in. It was a cold, calculated move. Jezebel had ruled through powerful symbols for decades. Now staring down her own end, she chose to face it not as a terrified victim hiding in the dark, but as a queen, a priestess, and herself. She took her place at an upper window perfectly visible to the crowds at the city gate below. When Jehu's chariot roared through the entrance of Jezreel, she was waiting. Her silhouette stood framed in the window, regal and completely defiant. "Is it peace, you Zimri, murderer of your master?" she mocked from above. This was no random insult. It was a calculated venom. By calling him Zimri, she compared Jehu to a cheap rebel who ruled Israel for only 7 days before meeting a brutal end. The warning beneath her words was razor sharp. "You might kill me now, but history will weigh you and find you worthless." Jehu stared up at this woman who had dominated Israel's politics for decades, the queen who had nearly destroyed the worship of Yahweh. The foreign queen who had planted Baal at the heart of the nation, his true nemesis. "Who is on my side? Who?" Jehu roared up at the window. The answer came from within the chambers. 2 or 3 eunuchs, palace servants, who had waited on the queen for years, looked out next to Jezebel. Men who had obeyed her for decades now faced a choice: stick with a dying dynasty or bow to the new king. "Throw her down," Jehu commanded. The biblical record of what happened next is brief and brutal. So they threw her down. Imagine that scene. Hands that had served her meals now gripping her body and shoving her over the ledge. The queen's scream cut short as she fell. The sickening impact of a body hitting the stone courtyard, blood splattering against the walls, and Jehu's chariot wheels. He didn't hesitate for a single second. He drove his horses straight over her corpse, crushing flesh and bone under heavy wheels. Then he stepped inside the palace to eat and drink, celebrating his triumph in her former home. Only after he had filled his belly did a moment of basic human decency finally show itself. "Go deal with this cursed woman and bury her because she is a king's daughter," he ordered. But when the servants went to gather Jezebel's remains, they found almost nothing left. Just her skull, her feet, and the palms of her hands. The rest had been devoured by the wild dogs of Jezreel, exactly as Elijah had warned. Jezebel's reign was over. Her final defiance hung in the empty window frame above the bloody street. The dogs had fulfilled the prophecy. Night fell over Jezreel, bringing a heavy, suffocating silence. The palace halls that once echoed with Jezebel's commands now shook with the rowdy victory songs of Jehu's men. Outside, dark shapes slinked through the shadows, hungry street dogs, drawn by the thick scent of fresh blood. Years before, the prophet Elijah had confronted Ahab with fury in his eyes, speaking words that seemed utterly impossible back then. "In the very place where dogs licked up the blood of Naboth, dogs will lick up your own blood." And his prediction for Jezebel was even more horrifyingly specific. "Dogs will devour Jezebel by the walls of Jezreel."
Those fiery warnings were now written in flesh and blood. The street dogs of the ancient world were no pets. They were vicious scavengers living on the wild edges of the city, feeding on garbage and posing a real threat to anyone walking alone at night. Now they had carried out their grim role in God's plan, devouring the body of the queen who had once promised to slaughter Elijah, just as she did the other prophets. When morning came and Jehu's soldiers went to bury her, they saw that the prediction had come true to the letter. Only her skull, her feet, and the palms of her hands were left, a grim detail the scriptures refused to hide. Why only those specific parts survived has puzzled historians for generations. Some believe the heavy cosmetics and pigments in her hair repelled the wild dogs. As for her hands and feet, perhaps their tough skin and sparse flesh made them look unappetizing. Whatever the reason, those scattered partial remains became a final indignity, one that even death itself could not spare her. There was simply not enough left of Jezebel to give her a proper burial. When the servants returned and told Jehu what they found, he only offered a grim nod. This was the very word of the Lord spoken through his servant Elijah the Tishbite on the dusty ground of Jezreel. Dogs will devour the flesh of Jezebel, and her corpse will lie like dung upon the face of the open field. The queen who once built grand temples and commanded great kings was now nothing but food for scavengers. Her remains lay scattered in the streets. For everyone who saw it, the message was clear. It was divine judgment made real in a brutal physical way. For the biblical writers, this grim ending was the only moral conclusion her life allowed. Her death was no mere political assassination. It was painted as holy justice. The queen who defied Yahweh lay scattered and unburied. In the ancient Near East, going without a proper burial was a terrifying fate, carrying immense sacred weight. Yet even in this gruesome end, there is something worth pausing over. Jezebel never ran. She never begged. She never abandoned her gods or backed down from her convictions. She remained entirely herself until her very last breath, meeting death with painted eyes and sharp, cutting words. The dogs of Jezreel had finally completed their prophetic work. Though her blood was licked from the stones, Jezebel's story was far from over. It was only just beginning, its long journey through human memory and imagination. The aftershock. Dawn broke over a changed Israel. Jehu was just getting started. Jezebel's death was merely the opening act in a brutal campaign to secure his throne and erase every trace of the house of Ahab. Like ripples spreading from a stone dropped into still water, the consequences of her fall were about to reach into every corner of the land. Jehu sent urgent letters to Samaria, where 70 sons of Ahab lived under the protection of the city elders. His message offered a dangerous false choice. Choose the best and most capable of your master's sons, put him on his father's throne, and fight for your master's legacy. It was a clear trap, and the elders of Samaria saw right through it. They knew what happened to Joram and Jezebel. Terrified, they surrendered completely, promising to do whatever Jehu asked of them. They refused to put any man on a throne. Then Jehu's second letter exposed his actual design. If you are truly on my side, bring me the heads of your master's sons here by tomorrow. The next day, 70 baskets arrived at the gates of Jezreel, each holding a prince's head. Jehu ordered them piled in 2 heap-like stacks at the city gate, a terrifying warning to anyone thinking of challenging his power. But the slaughter was far from over. Jehu wiped out everyone left of Ahab's house in Jezreel, officials, close friends, and priests, anyone tied to the old royal family. Next he set his sights on Samaria, bringing his bloody purge onto the open road. At the shearing house of the shepherds, he ran into 42 members of Judah's royal family, relatives of the dead king Ahaziah. Though they had no part in Jezebel's actions,
Their marriage ties linked them directly to Ahab's bloodline, and not a single one survived. Moving on toward Samaria, Jehu crossed paths with Jehonadab, the son of Rehab. Jehonadab was famous for clinging to old traditions and rejecting all the easy comforts and corruption of city life. Seeing a chance to give his bloodbath some holy authority, Jehu invited him to ride in his chariot. "Come along," he said, "and witness my zeal for Yahweh." With Jehonadab riding beside him to offer a stamp of sacred approval, Jehu swept into Samaria and slaughtered every last member of Ahab's family. The scriptures describe this outcome with cold, quiet efficiency. He wiped out Ahab's line in Samaria just as the Lord had promised Elijah. But Jehu saved his most dramatic cruelty for the followers of Baal, the surviving core of Jezebel's pagan legacy. He called for a massive sacrifice to Baal, even larger than anything Ahab had ever done. Devotees flooded in from all over Israel, filling Baal's temple to absolute capacity. Once they were locked inside, Jehu stationed 80 soldiers around the building, with strict orders that left no room for error. If anyone let a single target escape, they would pay for it with their own life. No sacrifice occurred. Instead, Jehu's men marched in and slaughtered everyone inside. They dragged out the sacred pillars and burned them. Then they pulled down the temple, turning it into a latrine as the ultimate insult. In one fast, coordinated wave of violence, Jehu had completely destroyed both the royal line and the pagan religion Jezebel spent her life building. The Omride dynasty that ruled Israel for decades was completely gone. The worship of Baal, which she brought to the land, was forced deep underground. Her grand temples lay in ruins. The writers of the Bible praised Jehu's religious cleansing, yet they remained quiet about his brutal methods. The ancient authors record that God praised Jehu, telling him he had done well by carrying out what was right in his eyes. Because he destroyed the house of Ahab as intended, his descendants would sit on the throne of Israel for 4 generations. But later prophets like Hosea would condemn the horrific bloodbath at Jezreel, suggesting that even a holy mission could not justify Jehu's extreme and ruthless violence. The fallout of Jezebel's fall grew into a political earthquake, leaving the kingdom transformed beyond all recognition. Yet Jezebel lived on. Long after the dogs finished their grim work in Jezreel, she remained locked in memory. The later prophets kept her story alive, not just as a historical event, but as a powerful symbol carrying meaning far beyond the woman herself. Through their writings, Jezebel outlived her death, growing larger than her story. She became a warning built into tradition, a spiritual shadow, a name carrying weight far beyond one lifetime. Hosea, writing about a century later, recalled the bloody memory of Jezreel when declaring judgment on Jehu's dynasty. Though he never named her directly, his sharp words kept that brutal history alive for generations who never saw it. Inside Jeremiah's writings, false prophets face condemnation. The words instantly made listeners think of the foreign priests Jezebel imported. When Jeremiah warned against those who prophesy by Baal and lead my people astray, the memory of Jezebel's pagan establishment felt absolutely unmistakable. Ezekiel too deployed his most raw, piercing words to attack spiritual betrayal. He used fierce feminine imagery that instantly brought back the dark memory of Jezebel. Whenever he spoke of Israel running after foreign gods, the people knew exactly who had built that road. Yet the much later book of Revelation contains her most direct named appearance. In a solemn letter sent to the church at Thyatira, the risen Christ condemns that woman Jezebel. She calls herself a prophetess, teaching and leading my servants into corruption and food sacrificed to idols. Of course, this was not the actual queen. She had been dead for nearly 1,000 years when Revelation was written. It was instead someone living inside the early Christian church whose teachings felt just as toxic. By using that ancient name, the writer summoned centuries of dark history, foreign corruption, lies, and betrayal. Through these prophetic voices, Jezebel became far more than just a dead queen. She stood for spiritual rot, the danger of outside cultures, and female power used to drag believers down a ruinous path. Her name became a warning sign, a specific type of spiritual danger the biblical writers kept pointing to. Was this brutal picture fair to the real woman? That is a different question. The prophets never cared about objective history. They wanted to shape a spiritual warning, sharing hard lessons for their people. Jezebel fit that mold beautifully. She was strong, foreign female, and loyal to gods they despised. Even so, the biblical texts cannot fully hide her real power. She is never shown as weak or helpless. She was dangerous because she was competent, iron-willed, and incredibly hard to break. The prophets attacked her with such fury because she almost succeeded in changing Israel's faith forever. In the minds of the prophets, Jezebel grew larger than a single historical life. She came to represent a repeating threat they constantly warned against: the pull of foreign ways, absolute power separated from true faith, and the tragedy of forgetting your roots. This long spiritual afterlife guaranteed she would never go quietly into the shadows. Long after her rivals became mere dust and names in dry family trees, her name still burned with life. Those ancient writers took a Sidonian princess and turned her into an eternal symbol. As long as those scrolls exist, Jezebel lives on. But was she a feminist icon? Beneath wide desert skies, ancient tales shift shape with every passing generation. Looking back across 3,000 years at this controversial queen, something strange happens. The ultimate biblical villain suddenly starts to look very different. A female icon, a misunderstood ruler, or a victim of propaganda written by the very men who hated her. Is there real truth in this new view? The answer is not simple. She clearly possessed traits that modern women might respect. She held real force in a world where women had none. She kept her own culture and faith, instead of changing to please her new home. She wielded genuine political power, not just a meaningless crown. And when executioners came, she met them with cold defiance, instead of begging or hiding in the shadows. Those traits, her grit, her fierce independence, and her courage, deeply connect with modern ideas of female strength. Today, some see a queen who refused to be pushed aside, a woman who carved out real power in a brutal world designed to keep her silent. But naming her a simple hero means ignoring the terrifying crimes the Bible accuses her of committing. The text says she arranged Naboth's murder just to steal a vineyard for her husband. It records her bloody purge of Yahweh's prophets. It paints her as bringing in pagan rites that dragged the entire nation into moral collapse. A deeper reading might look at these crimes while asking hard questions about who wrote the history. After all, her story was written entirely by her sworn enemies, men who hated her faith and her politics. They wanted to paint her as a monster. How would she look if the records had survived from her home in Sidonwat? What if we could read the journals of her court ladies, or the believers who loved the temples she financed? Those voices are gone. We are left with a portrait painted only by her enemies. Some modern scholars point out that focusing on her makeup and hair in her final moments shows deep ancient bias. Would a dying king's last stand be written with so much attention to his physical looks? Or would history keep its focus entirely on his military deeds? Maybe the truth refuses to put her in a simple box. She was neither a total monster nor a perfect hero, but a complicated person trying to survive a storm. Born a princess in wealthy Phoenicia, she was sent to a strict, isolated kingdom treated like a pawn on a royal chessboard. She brought her gods and her culture with her, shocking the conservative priests of her new home. Instead of quietly fitting in, she tried to change the nation she was given. That brave or reckless choice put her on a direct crash course with stubborn prophets who would never break. Modern feminist views. We do not need to make Jezebel perfect to find real value in her story. Perhaps the most genuinely human way to engage with her is simply to see her as a real participant in the events of her own era. She was neither a demon nor a saint, but a woman making tough choices within the hard walls of her moment. Her story reminds us that women always find paths to power, even inside societies designed to prevent it. It shows us that ancient writings often reveal more about the author's fears than about their actual subjects. And it proves how religious conflict becomes the main lens history uses to judge complex people who refuse to fit into neat boxes. Maybe she is not a perfect feminist icon, but Jezebel is certainly a woman worth understanding on her own terms, far beyond the caricature her enemies created. Think of the politics of idolatry. Picture a soft breeze in the cedar trees and the warm glow of oil lamps hitting stone pillars, with sweet incense drifting up toward carved wooden ceilings. This was the true world of Baal worship, not some wild scene of demonic evil we often imagine, but a sophisticated religious tradition with centuries of deep history and practice behind it. To truly understand Jezebel, we must look past the biblical condemnation and study what her religious tradition actually looked like. Modern archaeology has given us a picture of Phoenician faith that is far more detailed than what the biblical writers offered. Baal, whose name literally meant Lord, was the god of storms and fertility. In farming cultures where survival depended on rain and seasons, worshiping him made perfect sense. Recovered carvings and statues show him holding a bright lightning bolt or a raised spear, showing his power over life-giving rains. His consort, Asherah, who also appears in the Bible, was the goddess of fertility and motherhood. These were not just Phoenician gods, as Baal worship spread across the entire ancient Near East. Even within Israel, archaeology suggests that many ordinary people practiced a blended faith, weaving elements of Baal devotion right alongside the worship of Yahweh. In daily life, the boundaries between these faiths were far more fluid than biblical texts acknowledge. What made Jezebel's religious practices so dangerous to her opponents was not the rituals themselves, but the context in which she introduced them. Practicing private faith was not her only goal. She was pushing state-sponsored religious change across the entire nation. She built temples using royal funds. She supported hundreds of prophets and priests directly from the palace treasury. She elevated her gods to national prominence. This was not just religion, it was politics. In the ancient Near East, gods and kingship were bound together. Kings ruled by divine right, with the temple and palace functioning as twin centers of authority. By reshaping Israel's religious landscape, Jezebel was also shifting its political foundations. To Yahwistic prophets like Elijah, this was an existential crisis. Their entire identity rested on exclusive devotion to Yahweh. They believed kings were accountable to divine law, not the embodiment of divine will. Jezebel's religious program threatened both of these foundations at their core. The clash between Jezebel and Elijah was never just a polite theological debate. It was a battle for Israel's soul. Would the northern kingdom hold on to its unique faith or dissolve into the ways of its neighbors? Would its kings follow the Near Eastern model of divine kingship or stay answerable to prophets speaking for Yahweh alone? Modern archaeology in Samaria brings her actual reign into clearer focus. We find ivory carvings with Egyptian motifs and pottery bearing unique Phoenician designs, showing remnants of architecture carrying Sidonian influence. These objects confirm a court that embraced foreign culture wholeheartedly. But was Jezebel really a religious extremist bent on destroying the worship of Yahweh, as Scripture implies? Or was she a bridge builder, trying to connect Israel to the wider Mediterranean world? The truth lies somewhere in between. As a Sidonian princess, Jezebel grew up in a busy, cosmopolitan trading city. She was well accustomed to religious variety. Phoenician ports welcomed foreign merchants who all brought their own gods and rituals. To her, introducing Baal and Asherah to Israel might have seemed like smart diplomacy, not a hostile religious takeover. But Israel's prophets had always fought hard against this kind of compromise. Ever since Moses' prophetic voices demanded total loyalty to Yahweh. What seemed to Jezebel like natural cultural growth looked to them like a fatal betrayal. This ancient religious battle reveals a truth that still echoes in modern conflicts today. What looks like a simple theological debate is nearly always a much deeper struggle over cultural identity. It is about political power boundaries and community identity. Jezebel threatened more than just Israelite rituals. She threatened their very sense of a divine calling. Ultimately, the prophets won this battle. Jehu's violent purge wiped official Baal worship from the kingdom. Yet archaeology shows that the daily practices of ordinary folk remained a blended mix for a very long time after. The deep tension between official rules and how people actually lived their faith was never fully resolved. It is a cycle that keeps repeating across history, showing how women held power in the ancient Near East. The fading sun cast long shadows across the painted walls of royal chambers in Memphis, Hattusa, Nineveh, and Tyre. Within these ancient capitals, women walked quiet corridors of power. They carved out paths to influence in worlds that seemed built to keep them down. Jezebel was no exception to this rule. She belonged to a long, deep tradition of female rulers shaping history from behind the throne and sometimes right upon it. Take Egypt, where women like Hatshepsut did far more than advise kings. They ruled as pharaohs in their own right, not just as wives of the king. Hatep's even adopted the complete visual symbol of male power, even wearing the ceremonial false beard in portraits. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari stands to this day, commemorating a 200-year dynasty that came nearly 1,000 years before Jezebel. Closer to her own time, the Assyrian queen Shamu-Ramat, known to the Greeks as Semiramis, ruled as regent for her son and commanded armies in battle. Modern discoveries confirm her remarkable status. Her name was carved on stone monuments, usually reserved only for kings. Just like Jezebel, her legend grew grander with every passing generation, slowly turning a real queen into a larger-than-life myth. In the Hittite Empire, the queen bore the sacred title of Tawananna, keeping her office even after her husband died, to rule alongside the next king. They sent diplomatic letters to foreign lands and served their gods as high priestesses. Viewed in this light, Jezebel's grasp on the throne seems far less unusual. As the daughter of Ethbaal, king of Sidon and priest of Astarte, she grew up seeing faith and politics woven together as a natural part of crown rule. So when she joined Israel's royal house, she naturally brought those ideas with her. The Mediterranean she knew was undergoing what historians now call the Orientalizing period, an era of rich cultural mixing between East and West. Merchant ships carried not just goods, but new ideas, customs, and art across borders that once seemed solid. Royal women traveled between kingdoms as marriages sealed alliances between nations. Women like Jezebel carried their native faith and customs to whatever palace they were sent. The biblical writers judged her actions harshly, seeing her political moves as corruption rather than standard royal leadership. Yet her strategies, from funding priests to appointing court allies and arranging political marriages for her children, were normal tools of the trade. It was not how she ruled that made her different, but where she tried to do it. Israel's spiritual and political landscape was entirely unlike that of its neighbors. Prophets like Elijah answered to a divine voice that stood completely apart from and often against the crown. This set off instant conflict when she brought Phoenician-style rule to Israel's highly explosive court. Even after her life ended, her daughter Athaliah carried on this legacy of female power. When her son, King Ahaziah of Judah, died, Athaliah seized the throne herself and ruled for 6 years. Just like her mother before her, she died in a rebellion when temple priests plotted to put her young grandson Joash on the throne. Together they proved that women could carve out lasting positions of power inside a male-dominated world. They funded temples, managed palaces, negotiated royal weddings, and built loyal circles to gain influence that sometimes rivaled or even eclipsed the power of their husbands. Clay tablets and relics from across the region prove that these queens ran their own courts, owned large estates, ran businesses, and sometimes governed whole cities. Ancient signet rings with their names have been found proving these queens had the legal power to sign official decrees. Viewed this way, her life becomes less a simple story of one woman's hunger for power. Instead, it shows the inevitable clash when foreign ideas of leadership met Israel's unique laws and faith. Scripture paints her as a dangerous threat. But in the world where she grew up, she was only doing what Sidonian queens were raised to do. Her real tragedy was not her ambition. It was her failure to understand that power worked by entirely different rules in her new home. Long after she was gone, her name became a simple synonym for wicked female control. Yet during her lifetime, she only walked paths worn smooth by generations of queens before her. The ancient world produced many strong women whose stories have faded over time. She is remembered not because she was unique, but because her enemies wrote her story with enough power to carry it across 3,000 years. Jezebel in Jewish lore. Stars flicker over ancient synagogues where for hundreds of years teachers and scholars unrolled sacred scrolls, studying every word with deep care. Inside those old schoolrooms, her legacy continued to grow and shift. Traditional Jewish teachers saw her as a powerful symbol and a vital warning, a figure they could study to teach lessons about faith, loyalty, and living a righteous life. Her earliest commentary appears in the pages of the Talmud, that massive collection of rabbinic debates put together between the 3rd and 5th centuries. In these texts, the ancient sages fill in the blanks left by Scripture, asking questions the Bible leaves quiet. One famous commentary digs into why she deserved such a brutal and specific death. The teachers, always searching for poetic justice in these ancient scriptures, believed that her body being eaten by dogs matched her specific sins. In these debates, one point of view suggests she would dance before young men to seduce them, jingling ankle bells like the dancers in pagan temples. This ancient interpretation turned the deep political and religious battles of the Bible into a simple story of sexual misbehavior. Another rabbinic tradition focused on Queen Jezebel's name. In Hebrew, her name seemed to combine the words for "where is" and "dung." This rabbinic wordplay suggested that Queen Jezebel's name actually predicted her dark end. She would end as dung scattered across an open field, exactly as the prophet had warned. The great Jewish scholars of the Middle Ages kept shaping her story for their times. Rashi, the famous 11th century French teacher, wrote that when the Bible says Jezebel painted her eyes, she did it purely to look beautiful. Rashi saw this as proof of her vanity, a pride that stayed with her even as death stood at the door. But other scholars saw her last moments differently. They believed she dressed up not out of vanity, but to meet her death with the dignity of a ruling queen. In the mystical teachings of the Kabbalah, Jezebel represents the Sitra Achra, the other side of spiritual impurity. Her foreign gods and her war against the prophets made her the perfect symbol of opposition to holiness. In Musar literature, the Jewish teachings on ethics, she became a warning. Her story showed how power without a spiritual foundation always leads to deep corruption. These writers often compared her to the righteous women of the Bible, like Sarah, Rebecca, and Queen Esther. Those were women who used their influence to protect their people, not defy God. Yet Jewish tradition kept a surprisingly complicated view of this ancient queen. They never excused her actions or cleared her name. Still, rabbinic teachers sometimes pointed out traits in her that deserved a bit of respect. The Talmud notes that King Ahab ruled for 22 years, partly because he honored his wife and respected the sacred scriptures, which contained 22 letters. Even while condemning what she stood for, this tradition recognized that loving a spouse was a good thing. Some ancient stories even suggest her loyalty to her childhood religion, though seen as wrong, showed a real strength of character. She stayed true to the gods of her youth, refusing to switch to her husband's religion just to gain political power. This stubborn loyalty to her own gods held a tiny spark of devotion that teachers found admirable. Later Hasidic masters would draw profound spiritual lessons from her life. One teaching suggested her name contained a word meaning dwelling, hinting that even a soul in the darkest place might become a home for God through genuine repentance or teshuvah. Though the Bible never says the queen herself turned back her dark path, could inspire others to make the change she never did. As Jewish communities faced centuries of hard persecution and pressure to blend into other cultures, the story of Queen Jezebel felt deeply personal to them. In medieval Europe, Jewish scholars saw her foreign worship as a warning, a mirror reflecting the very real temptation to abandon their own sacred traditions for the ways of the world around them. For Jewish women, she stood as a stark warning against abusing power, but as times changed, some began to ask if her dark reputation came from actual wicked deeds or simply from a deep fear of powerful women. Today, modern Jewish thinkers look closely at how ancient writers shaped the story of this Phoenician queen, searching for the real woman behind the legends. Through all of these different views, the tradition kept her as a highly complex person, never just cast aside, but always worth studying again. Her life became a mirror where people found their own questions about staying true to faith, using power wisely, and the place of women in spiritual spaces. In synagogues and places of study, whenever the old scrolls were opened to the kings of Israel, the name of Queen Jezebel still stirred deep feelings, proving her lasting grip on the mind. Now let us look at her in the Christian mind. Here her name rings through history like a warning bell. By the time of the book of Revelation, written long after her death, she is no longer just a person of flesh and blood. The writer speaks of a false prophetess who claims that name, leading people far astray. With that one verse, she steps out of the history books and becomes a spiritual symbol. Christians in the Middle Ages deeply feared what she stood for. Monks copying old holy texts would sometimes stop at her name, make the sign of the cross, and only then keep writing. To them, she was not just a dead queen, but a shadow waiting to strike a spiritual danger, waiting to appear in any woman who stepped out of line. During the European witch trials, her name became a label for any woman who dared to speak up. Preachers shouted from pulpits, pointing to her painted face and cold stare at the window as proof of the danger of female pride. Any woman seen as too loud or independent was suddenly compared to this ancient queen, a dangerous label that could cost her her life. Later Protestant reformers used the story of Queen Jezebel as a weapon. When Martin Luther attacked the Catholic Church, he called the Pope far worse than any ancient queen. The Scottish reformer John Knox wrote a famous tract attacking Mary, Queen of Scots. He compared her directly to the wicked Phoenician queen who had led the ancient people of Israel far from God. Soon the idea of a Jezebel spirit took root in America, spreading fast through early Christian revival meetings. Preachers described this spirit as a force seeking to tear down men, especially those in spiritual leadership. They warned congregations to watch for the warning signs, patterns of control, manipulation, and seduction, all wrapped up in the image of a painted queen watching from her window. Frontier camp meetings featured fiery sermons about Jezebel hiding in plain sight. Any woman wearing too much jewelry or speaking with too much confidence was quietly pulled aside for correction. The fear was not just about female power. It ran deeper, a quiet dread that genuine faith could be eaten away from within by an invisible rot. Modern evangelical books keep this going with titles on defeating the Jezebel spirit, lining the shelves of church bookstores. These books blend the biblical story with ideas about spiritual warfare, creating a Jezebel far more supernatural than anything in the Book of Kings. She is no longer just a historical queen. She is a timeless rebel against God. For centuries, Christian artists have painted Jezebel standing at her window, frozen in the final moment before her death. Medieval manuscripts show her tiny and distant, but Renaissance painters focus heavily on the moral drama, contrasting her expensive clothes with the bloody violence about to happen. Her makeup becomes a cold mask, and what lies behind that mask, the old warnings say, is pure darkness. Modern Christian movies and novels still use her name to build tension. They pit her directly against the prophet Elijah, framing a showdown between female manipulation and male prophecy, between human plots and divine truth. These stories smooth over the messy politics of her real life, focusing only on the moral of her violent end. But even within the church, some voices are starting to push back. Women theologians are rereading Jezebel's story, asking a hard question. How much of her villain status comes from the fact that her enemies wrote the history? They ask how many parts of her life would read differently if the telling had come from her instead of those who cheered for her fall. What about Jezebel in Islam? Unlike other biblical figures in Islamic texts, she is completely missing from the Quran. That silence says a lot. While characters like Solomon and David and Moses serve as bridges between faiths, Jezebel stays strictly in Jewish and Christian stories. Her name never appears in Islamic scripture. This leaves a fascinating gap. Islam honors many of the same prophets but says absolutely nothing about Elijah's massive clash with Jezebel. The dramatic showdown at Mount Carmel, the very heart of her biblical story, simply is not there. When Islamic tradition speaks of Elijah, known as Elias in Arabic, the focus is entirely on calling people back to God. The royal queen who fought him goes completely unnamed and unmentioned. If Jezebel had been included in Islamic texts, she might have been grouped with other women who fought the prophets, like Pharaoh's wife, or the wife of Abu Lahab, who threw thorns in Muhammad's path. Instead, she is unheard of. When Muslim scholars look at biblical stories missing from the Quran, they view these gaps as corrections to old stories, or as God choosing only what is absolutely necessary for faith. Even without her name, the concept of a powerful woman fighting God's messenger does pop up in Islamic folklore. These old stories warn about women using beauty and influence to lead righteous men astray. These warnings share the same themes as Jezebel's story without naming her. But in places where Christians and Muslims have lived side by side, normal cultural sharing between neighbors has sometimes carried the story of Jezebel into Muslim households. In parts of Lebanon, Turkey, and Egypt, local folklore still mentions her, mixing her tale with local legends until the biblical details fade. She is just a wicked queen who met a terrible end. Modern Muslim scholars looking at history sometimes mention Jezebel when studying ancient Israel. They treat her as a real political figure, not a spiritual lesson. Focusing on the politics of her era and the massive culture clash of her marriage to Ahab, they analyze her through the cold lens of history, not moral lessons. Her total absence from Islamic tradition offers a fascinating comparison of how different faiths use the exact same history. While Christianity turned her into a timeless symbol of temptation and corruption, Islam simply moved on. This shows how religions choose which stories to shout and which ones to let fade away. For Muslims living in the West today, Jezebel is often a completely foreign reference when used by their Christian neighbors. Hearing her name used as shorthand for a manipulative or seductive woman means nothing to them. The context is totally lost. The name carries no heavy history, no hidden meanings, and zero baggage. That is a sharp contrast to how Christians use it. This gap also means Muslim women have been spared one particular type of religious attack. No Muslim woman, no matter how powerful or controversial, has ever had to bear the heavy label of being called a Jezebel. The name was never weaponized against them, unlike the way it has targeted Christian women for generations. Perhaps what is most fascinating is how this whole situation shows the highly selective nature of sacred memory. Three faiths sharing so many of the same stories and figures can drift so completely apart when it comes to others. Take Jezebel. She was prominent enough to fill dozens of Hebrew Bible verses and powerful enough to stand against prophets and kings. Yet she simply vanishes the moment you step from Christian tradition into Islamic understanding. Consider the archaeology of Samaria and Jezreel. The spade uncovers what old texts keep hidden. When researchers first broke ground at ancient Samaria in the early 1900s, they were not just digging for pottery shards, they were searching for Jezebel's world. And what they found changed her. Ancient scrolls into a living woman. She walked real streets and lived in real palaces whose foundations still stand today. Samaria sits high on a hill looking out over fertile valleys below. Its natural defensive position made it a perfect spot for a capital. Excavations eventually brought to light massive stone walls dating back to the time of Omri and Ahab, who were Jezebel's father-in-law and husband. These were not rough or primitive fortifications. They used sophisticated ashlar masonry blocks, proving incredible wealth and deep technical skill. The Bible claims Ahab built an ivory palace. Amazingly, this was no exaggeration. Archaeologists found breathtaking, delicate ivory pieces, hundreds of them, which once adorned furniture and walls throughout the palace. These pieces show unmistakable Phoenician craftsmanship mixed with Egyptian motifs like lotus flowers, sphinxes, and kings on thrones. Many scholars believe Jezebel brought these styles with her from Tyre. Her own eyes once admired these exact curves and patterns. A stone seal discovered in Israel bears the letters YZBL. This was quite possibly Jezebel's personal seal. Used on official documents, it confirms a truth often overlooked. She ruled as a real queen. She had actual power, not just the monster that history reduced her to. The seal shows Egyptian style. It highlights her worldly court. Beneath the dirt, archaeology reveals immense prosperity during the reign of Ahab and Jezebel. Imported pottery, Egyptian scarabs, and luxury goods from across the sea show a kingdom deeply tied to wealthy trade networks. They did not ruin Israel. The physical evidence strongly suggests their reign brought real economic growth and cultural exchange. Down at Jezreel, the site of her death excavations uncovered a massive fortress. It had huge corner towers. This royal compound matches up closely with the biblical description of a second palace where the king and queen sometimes stayed. Standing there, you can almost see Jehu's chariot thundering closer. You can picture Jezebel waiting at her window. The religious war at the heart of Jezebel's life also left marks in the dirt. Archaeologists have dug up small female figurines, likely representing the goddess Asherah, a deity often worshipped alongside Baal. These turned up in ordinary homes, not just palaces, suggesting that the pagan worship Jezebel promoted had already taken root among the common people. Stone altars matching the biblical descriptions of Baal worship sites have also been unearthed. Several of these altars show signs of deliberate smashing, likely done during the religious purges after her death. These shattered stones reveal the violent religious whiplash the local people suffered as royal policy swung back and forth. Water systems from this era show incredible engineering skills. Deep shafts were carved through solid bedrock to reach hidden springs securing water during long sieges. The impressive waterworks at Megiddo and Hazor likely mirrored those in Samaria, proving that despite her religious choices, Jezebel's kingdom invested heavily in critical public works. Climate studies in the region have found evidence of a terrible drought during the 9th century before Christ. This is the exact period when the Bible places Elijah's dramatic showdown with Baal's prophets over ending the drought. This scientific proof of a real climate crisis adds weight to the biblical account, showing it likely preserves the memory of real historical events. Though it is filtered through theology, no physical find directly proves her gory death. There are no dog bones piled up in Jezreel, and no ancient bloodstains on the rocks. Yet the layout of the excavated palace perfectly aligns with the biblical account of her being thrown from the window. This physical setting makes the story feel real in a way pure fiction never could. Most of all, archaeology reveals what texts try to hide. Jezebel lived in a diverse kingdom where Israelite traditions blended easily with Phoenician, Egyptian, and Canaanite cultures. The ruins show no hard separations between belief systems, but rather a constant mixing of ideas, art, and worship. This wider context explains why her introduction of Phoenician religion was not nearly as foreign or shocking as biblical writers later claimed. When you hold an artifact from her time, a pottery shard, a stone weight, or a fragment of carved ivory, you are touching her world directly. These simple objects cross thousands of years, connecting us to a queen who was never allowed to tell her own story, yet whose presence remains deeply buried in the very soil of Israel. Over centuries, her name was sharpened into a blade and held against the throats of countless women. Jezebel, once just the name of a Phoenician princess, became one of history's ultimate insults. Few names have ever traveled so far from where they started or cut so deeply when spoken aloud. In colonial America, white slaveholders twisted her story into a racial weapon. They pinned the label of Jezebel onto enslaved black women, painting them as naturally seductive and morally corrupt. This deliberate stereotype falsely cast victims as temptresses. They justified sexual violence by blaming the victims. The cruel irony here is hard to ignore. Jezebel, once a powerful foreign queen, became a tool used to strip power from the most vulnerable women. For generations, the Jezebel stereotype poisoned American race relations. It let white society dismiss black women as completely different, casting them as highly sexual, unvirtuous, and unworthy of the protections white women enjoyed. Inside courtrooms, a black woman seeking justice for assault faced whispers of Jezebel. Her humanity was doubted, all because of an ancient pagan queen she had never even worshipped. At the same time, suffragists fighting for the vote were branded as Jezebels by those who opposed them. Cruel political cartoons showed them with painted faces and proud, mocking eyes, mimicking the biblical queen's final stand. The warning was clear. Seek power, end up like her. Thrown down, destroyed, remembered only as a dark warning. During the temperance era, women fighting alcohol were compared to Jezebel, yet they turned around and hurled her name at so-called fallen women. The double standard was ignored. The very people using her name as a weapon were being attacked with it themselves. The queen's identity had become a circular firing squad in America's cultural battles. With the sexual revolution of the 1960s, traditional religious voices brought back the Jezebel insult with a vengeance. Women wearing short skirts or pleading for reproductive freedom were labeled modern Jezebels, blamed for dragging the country toward moral collapse, just as the pagan queen had led Israel to worship Baal. Her name became quick shorthand for any woman defying traditional authority. Today, echoes of this ancient insult still linger in the office. An ambitious woman is often targeted with whispers of being manipulative and scheming, labels tied to Jezebel for centuries. A woman's professional assertiveness still summons up images of that painted queen waiting at her window, assumed to rely on seductive charm and cold calculation instead of real skill. Eventually, the music and entertainment worlds embraced and even reclaimed her name. Blues singers wove her into their songs, sometimes celebrating her raw power, other times warning listeners about women like her. When Frankie Lane sang Jezebel in 1951, "Jezebel, Jezebel, if the devil was ever born without horns, it was you, Jezebel, it was you." He locked her in as the ultimate dangerous woman. Then came a strange twist of fate. Some black communities began reclaiming Jezebel as a term of strength, a way to describe a woman too bold, too independent, and entirely unwilling to shrink for the comfort of others. This is a familiar pattern. You drain the poison from a word by claiming ownership of it. The ancient queen might have liked this defiance. Soon the internet age brought us websites like Jezebel.com, using her name to signal sharp feminist commentary that gladly challenges patriarchal rules. This modern spin tries to completely clear her name, proving that history's so-called wicked women were simply those who refused to sit quietly, a trait we now praise instead of punish. Today, when someone hurls the name Jezebel, they rarely think of 9th century BC politics in Israel or Phoenician temple rituals. Instead, they summon centuries of deep-seated bias, viewing female desire as dangerous, female ambition as plotting, and female power as naturally corrupt. Very few who use the insult know anything true about the real queen who ruled and died in ancient Samaria. Yet they keep carrying the heavy weight of her name, totally unaware of the burden. Across the centuries, artists simply could not resist Jezebel. Her dramatic life and brutal death offered everything a creator could ever want: beauty, power, violence, divine punishment, all wrapped in an exotic backdrop. On canvas after canvas, painters reinvented her. Every generation projected its own deep anxieties and desires onto this ancient queen. Medieval artists, illustrating manuscripts, painted her small and highly stylized, a crowned figure falling headfirst from a high window while wild dogs waited below. These simple sketches served as moral warnings, not true portraits, just grim theological footnotes on the high price of sin. The artists cared nothing for actual historical accuracy. In their drawings, Jezebel wears medieval European gowns, her Phoenician roots completely ignored. Later Renaissance painters transformed her entirely. Under their brushes, she became curvaceous and pale-skinned, wrapped in luxurious fabrics that barely covered her body. Gustave Moraro's famous 1865 painting shows her as an exotic seductress surrounded by ivory and gold, her beauty flawless, even in the face of death. These painters were not illustrating scripture so much as designing erotic fantasies hidden under the cloak of religious respectability. The Pre-Raphaelites found a perfect subject in Jezebel, beautiful, doomed, and morally gray. John Byam Liston Shaw's 1896 painting, titled Jezebel, captures her final moments with high dramatic intensity. She stands proud in royal purple while her servants dress her for death. The artwork captures something easily missed in basic retellings: her sheer dignity and defiance in the very face of her inevitable destruction. stage plays took even bigger liberties with her history. When the playwright Jean Rhine wrote Athalie in 1691, he focused on her daughter Athalia, but his portrayal of the mother's lingering, ghost-like influence held all the dread Europeans associated with her name. The show's that massive success firmly locked in Jezebel as the ultimate wicked queen of the Western imagination. Naturally, operas soon embraced her. Intense drama, raw emotion, and spectacular death scenes offered everything composers wanted. Yet, strangely, almost no major opera puts her at the center of the stage. Instead, she is only mentioned in passing, her name thrown out whenever a librettist needed quick shorthand for feminine evil. Keeping her out of the spotlight says something uncomfortable about her story. Maybe she was simply too powerful, too independent to fit into an easy dramatic box. Literary portraits are much more varied and complex. When Marcel Proust referenced her in Search of Lost Time, he used her to show how society reduces complex people into flat stereotypes. Herman Melville did something similar in Moby Dick, proving how names carry heavy histories that shape our feelings deep down. Modern novels offer kinder views, like Elela Nena Diong's 1956 book. Her Jezebel was among the first to imagine things from the queen's own perspective. It suggested she was simply following her own culture in a foreign land. Newer fictional accounts, including The Witch of Jezreel by Thea Kenyon and Leslie Hazelton's book Jezebel, The Untold Story, they correct centuries of biased stories. Today, art finds fresh meaning in her life. Feminist artists use her name to show how powerful women get demonized throughout history. Photographer Renee Cox's controversial piece, Yo Mama's Last Supper, does not show Jezebel directly. Instead, it wrestles with similar themes of how female bodies become battlegrounds in religious and cultural wars. The literary journal Jezebel's Daughter started publishing women's writing in 2010. They aimed to reclaim her legacy as a woman whose story was written only by her enemies. Their manifesto says, "For too long, Jezebel has been a name thrown at women who refuse to stay silent." The writers named themselves after her, in solidarity with those whose stories were twisted for other purposes. Meanwhile, children's Bible illustrations still keep simplifying her into a straightforward villain. Painted face, haughty look, and jewels representing nothing but vanity. These pictures reach children before they can think critically, making sure each new generation buys into the traditional view long before they ever hear another side of the story. Even theaters now look for deeper layers in her character. A 2018 off-Broadway play called Painted imagined Jezebel's private thoughts as she put on makeup for that final confrontation, focusing on raw power and facing death on her own terms. The one-woman show won praise for humanizing a queen long reduced to a cartoon. Most revealing of all is how paintings of Jezebel reflect the beauty standards of their own times rather than actual history. From pale Renaissance styles to exotic Orientalist fantasies to diverse modern art artists reveal much more about themselves than they do about the actual Phoenician queen. She becomes a mirror reflecting each society's real feelings about female power, foreign influence, and moral authority. In every brushstroke and sentence written about Jezebel, creators show our lasting obsession with women who cross lines. Though her body was eaten by dogs, her memory has been brought back, rewritten and reshaped over and over. It is proof that a strong woman, even one hated in holy books, never really fades away. Now look at Jezebel in pop culture. Her name sells magazines. In 1957, a magazine called Jezebel hit the stands. It featured pin-ups and bold stories that seem tame today, but they deeply shocked conservative America back then. Those publishers knew exactly what they were doing. 3,000 years after her death, her name still meant forbidden desire and dangerous charm. Music could not resist her name when Frankie Lane's song Jezebel topped the charts in 1951. Listeners loved the lyrics about a woman with a heart of stone. The hit triggered covers across different genres, from Edith Piaf's passionate French version to Shirley Bassey's theatrical delivery. Each artist found something different in the old queen's tale. Iron and Wine's quiet 2005 song Jezebel took a softer route, asking, "Who has seen Jezebel, the woman born for us to blame?" He sings about being just as brave as her. These lyrics reveal a deeper truth. It is so easy to let a female villain carry all our darkest shadows, making everyone else look pure by comparison. Hollywood caught on to Jezebel's raw dramatic potential very early. The 1938 movie Jezebel, starring Bette Davis, does not actually retell the biblical story. Instead, we see a headstrong Southern belle whose behavior echoes the ancient queen's wild defiance. The title alone told viewers everything they needed to know about the lead character. TV shows have scattered her name across decades of programming. Whenever a ruthless woman pops up on a soap opera, other characters often mutter her name under their breath. Writers trust viewers to understand this code instantly. No explanation is needed for one of our culture's most lasting insults. Comic books and graphic novels have occasionally played with her legend. For example, Neil Gaiman's Sandman series points to her through other characters who also suffer for defying strict religious rules. These smart stories assume we already know the drill: powerful woman, holy war, bloody end. Even fashion took on her name for bold, seductive styling. Makeup lines, high-end perfumes, and clothing brands have all used her name to sell bold femininity. The irony is heavy. The real Jezebel's painted face and royal robes were symbols of royal dignity and pride, not tricks to seduce men. Yet modern ads turn her last brave stand into nothing but simple vanity. Then internet culture launched Jezebel.com in 2007, a site offering feminist takes on news, politics, and media. Choosing that name was a bold move to reclaim the insult, proving they were willing to fight the standard narratives. The site's massive success introduced younger generations to this ancient queen, often framing her as misunderstood instead of wicked. Drag performers also found plenty of inspiration in her tragic story, using names like Jezebel Bardot or Miss Jezebel to put on shows playing with extreme femininity, power, and defiance, often with a knowing wink to how the world punishes women who stand out. These acts turn an ancient tragedy into modern strength. Halloween costumes labeled as a sexy Jezebel pop up online every October. They usually offer cheap biblical robes, thick eye makeup, and revealing cuts, stripping away all historical weight and political tension, reducing a queen who once went toe-to-toe with powerful prophets and kings into a simple shorthand for female temptation. Romance novels often use Jezebel as a character description or even a title. These stories often follow women seen as manipulative, who slowly show their vulnerable side. This arc quietly challenges the traditional view of the biblical queen, suggesting labeled women are simply misunderstood. Today, comedy sketches and stand-up routines bring her up to highlight double standards. Men get called assertive for the very same behavior that gets women branded as Jezebel, one comedian notes. This shows how ancient tales still shape modern views of gender. The laughter from these jokes proves audiences still connect with her story today. Video games feature Jezebel-like characters, usually casting them as evil sorceresses or corrupt queens. These digital versions keep her framed as a mere obstacle to beat rather than a human worth understanding. Players defeat her without ever asking if history treated her fairly. Perhaps most telling is how easily her name slips into daily speech. Calling a celebrity a real Jezebel for behavior that would go unnoticed in a man draws on centuries of deep gendered judgment. Her complex real life is buried, turning this ancient queen into a conversational weapon. Jezebel's presence in pop culture, from music to fashion and films, shows us something vital about collective memory. Rebels challenging social structures never truly die. They survive as warning signs and inspirations, mirroring our anxieties about power and gender. Let us ask, what if the dogs never came? Historians usually avoid these questions, but imagining a different past can illuminate what actually happened. If Jezebel had won, if Jehu's rebellion had failed and her religious changes took root, our modern world might look completely different. Had Baal worship become Israel's main faith, the monotheistic tradition might have grown in very different ways, or perhaps failed entirely. Judaism could have remained a minor regional sect instead of a major distinct religion. Without that foundation, Christianity and Islam might never have been born. Three massive world religions, billions of believers across history, all potentially resting on whether this one queen's policies survived. Scholars point to a fascinating possibility here. Ancient Israelite worship was likely far more diverse than the Bible suggests. Archaeology shows that many ordinary people blended their worship of Yahweh with other gods like Baal and Asherah. Jezebel's policies were not imposing something foreign, but officially supporting practices that were already popular. Some historians believe she was trying to build a genuine cultural bridge, shaping a multi-faith society where both cultures coexisted. Her temples to Baal did not require abandoning Yahweh, they offered a choice. But early tolerance failed, replaced by Jehu's violent enforcement of worshiping Yahweh alone. Political marriages, like the alliance between Jezebel and Ahab, were standard diplomacy in the ancient world. If their partnership had secured a lasting peace between their lands, this northern kingdom could have resisted the brutal Assyrians longer with strong coastal alliances. The tragic fall of Israel and the loss of the 10 northern tribes, a defining historical event, might have been entirely avoided. Historians note Phoenician trade made Israel much wealthier. Jezebel brought a deep understanding of Tyre's wealthy trading networks. If her descendants had maintained her royal influence, Israel might have joined Mediterranean trade, becoming more cosmopolitan and less vulnerable to invading inland empires. The powerful prophetic voice that defines so much of the Bible grew directly in opposition to the throne, especially against Ahab and Jezebel. Had the royals won, prophets like Elijah might be seen as failed rebels rather than spiritual giants. The entire idea of prophecy, the bold act of speaking truth to power, might never have become so central to faith. Scholars note that much of the Bible took shape after the Babylonian exile, long after her. Had her policies become the accepted norm, later writers would have recorded her reign quite differently. The ancient texts might have praised her modern vision instead of condemning her foreign ways. Perhaps most fascinating is how the lives of women might have changed. Phoenician culture generally gave women much higher social status than Israel did. If her influence lasted, Hebrew society might have developed entirely different gender roles. Women's freedom in worship and politics could have expanded instead of shrinking over the centuries. Even the core idea of idolatry, so vital to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, was shaped by fighting the pagan worship Jezebel supported. Without this bitter struggle, monotheism might have welcomed visual symbols and artwork in worship instead of focus on written texts. Our modern ideas of worship would probably look completely different today. Militarily, the coup succeeded with support from Assyria, which wanted to weaken Israel. If Jezebel's heirs had kept the throne and their Phoenician allies, a very different balance of power would have emerged. The ancient map of the Near East, and indeed the entire course of world history, would have changed completely. Today, our multi-faith world still struggles with the same questions she faced. Can different religions truly live together in peace? And who gets to decide what counts as proper faith? What happens when raw state power aligns with one specific faith? Her broken attempt to blend two cultures together still raises hard questions for our own divided world. Those violent shifts in policy forcing people to worship Yahweh, then tolerating Baal, then back again, left deep scars on the ancient nation. We see this pattern of brutal, state-enforced faith repeat again and again. It makes you wonder if Jezebel's path, had it actually succeeded, would have set a very different path for handling diverse beliefs. But we will never truly know. Speculating is just a mental exercise. Yet looking at these lost paths reveals how fragile history really is. Israel balanced on a knife edge under Jezebel, the entire spiritual map of our world. The beliefs of billions today might trace back to whether one queen could survive her enemies. Now let us look at Ahab. History has misjudged him for centuries. While Jezebel grabs the spotlight with her fierce defiance, Ahab has always stayed in the shadows, usually cast as a weak king ruled by his foreign queen. But a closer look at the surviving records reveals a much deeper, more complex man. A sharp politician steering through treacherous times with remarkable skill. The ancient writers themselves give us conflicting accounts. At first, they brand Ahab as the most wicked king in Israel's history, but moments later, he is talking calmly with prophets, showing deep regret when corrected and genuinely caring for his people. These contradictions suggest a leader far more complicated than the history books let on. Dirt and stones from his reign tell a very different story than the sacred texts. Under Ahab, Samaria built advanced water pipelines, strengthened its city walls, and opened massive trade routes. Projects like these took real vision and strong leadership. The physical evidence does not show a puppet, but a strong king leading a wealthy nation. On the battlefield, his tactics were brilliant. When Ben-Hadad of Damascus surrounded Samaria, Ahab bargained carefully, then struck back with a surprise raid when the enemy's demands became insulting. Later, at the Battle of Karkar, he brought one of the biggest chariot fleets to an alliance that successfully stopped the Assyrian Empire, saving Israel from conquest for another 100 years. Today, historians are rethinking the bond between Ahab and Jezebel. They saw it as a partnership, not a dictatorship. Their marriage secured the western border and unlocked rich Phoenician trade. In this light, Ahab, letting his people worship Baal, looks less like spineless surrender and more like a calculated plan to keep a powerful ally happy. The famous struggle over Naboth's vineyard shows how they actually worked together. While Jezebel devises the deadly plot, Ahab's first reaction is telling. He does not threaten Naboth. He simply accepts the refusal and goes home to pout. Only when his wife steps in does he get what he wants. This shows she did not control him. They simply played different matching roles. Ancient Jewish tradition actually offers a surprisingly balanced take on Ahab. Even the Talmud records that, despite his spiritual failures, he brought wealth to his land, was highly respected abroad, and tolerated the holy prophets far better than many good kings ever did. One ancient writing even claims he has a place in heaven. His dealings with these prophets show unusual patience. Other rulers threw critics in prison or had them killed, but not Ahab. Ahab kept his court open, letting Elijah and Micaiah speak freely, even when they directly cursed him. And after Elijah slaughtered the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel, Ahab did not punish Elijah or stop him from fleeing. Such restraint was unheard of for kings back then. The final moments of Ahab's life reveal his true character. Though Micaiah warned him that he would die on the battlefield, he still led his army into combat himself. When a stray arrow pierced his armor, he ordered his driver to hold him upright in the chariot so the soldiers would not panic. He stood there bleeding for hours until the sun went down, keeping his army strong. That is not the act of a weakling. Today we might see Ahab as a realist trapped between two extremes. He faced intense Yahweh worshippers at home and powerful allies abroad. He tried to keep the peace by letting different faiths coexist. Like many who try to walk the middle road, he pleased neither side, and the group that won got to write his history. After him, his son Ahaziah ruled for only 2 years before a fatal fall. His other son, Joram, ruled for 12 quiet years before Jehu's rebellion, proving that Ahab had built a stable government that could survive without him. This strong track record contradicts the sacred story of a nation ready to crumble because of the king's faith policies. Perhaps the most revealing clues come from outside the Bible. Ancient Assyrian stones describing the Battle of Karkar name Ahab the Israelite as a major power bringing more war chariots than any other king. These foreign records reveal a king who commanded deep respect, not some weak husband ruled by his wife. Royal marriage back then was about treaty-making, not romance. Judging their marriage by our modern standards completely misses the point of their political alliance. Ahab won wealth and trade, while Jezebel gained room for her own gods and culture. Their partnership was highly effective. One modern scholar notes that in many ways, Ahab was the most secular ruler Israel ever had. Maybe this practical focus, choosing stable rule over religious purity, is exactly why the sacred texts condemn him so fiercely, even while physical evidence proves his strength as a builder. Like many rulers who chose daily peace over religious wars, his reputation suffered because the texts were written by people with totally different values. This new view does not show a saint who was unfairly hated, but a practical ruler navigating some truly messy politics. Ahab's tolerance, which biblical writers called weakness, might have actually been smart management of a very divided kingdom. Making room for different religions did not make him Jezebel's puppet. It showed he knew that keeping the peace takes compromise. When we look closely, Ahab does not look like the weak shadow of a powerful queen. Instead, he was her equal partner in an alliance that brought both massive gains and heavy costs to ancient Israel. Their story proves that simple historical labels usually hide the messy reality of those who lived there. They loved, ruled, and died in a world so different from ours, under a God who never forgot. This entire story begins and ends with Yahweh. Long before Jezebel was even born or Ahab took Israel's throne, prophets spoke of a single God who would tolerate absolutely no rivals. And long after her bones were scattered in the dust of Jezreel, when her very name meant defiance, that same God was still there, watching and shaping history with patient hands. Back then, ancient religions always tied their gods to specific lands. Baal ruled the storms in Canaan, Marduk controlled Babylon, and Asherah dominated Assyria. Gods stayed in their own territories, highly powerful but strictly local. Jezebel probably arrived in Israel with this exact mindset, wanting Baal to stand right next to Yahweh, not replace him. But what she found was something entirely different. Here was a God who claimed power over the entire world, not just Israel. A God who dismissed all other deities as mere wood and stone. This massive claim made any compromise completely impossible. Other nations could easily adopt new gods, but this faith could not. The exclusive demands of Yahwism clashed with her Phoenician worship from the very start. Then came a terrible drought during her early years in Samaria, sparking a massive spiritual clash. For 3 whole years, not a single drop of rain fell. This directly challenged Baal, the god of storms and crops. When Elijah finally brought fire down from heaven at Mount Carmel, it proved who actually held real power over the forces of nature. The storm following Baal's defeat carried a meaning far deeper than just a bit of wet weather. Prophets like Elijah and Elisha were far more than simple social critics or court reformers. They claimed to speak the direct words of Yahweh. This prophetic movement was completely brand new in the ancient world. These outsiders stood far away from palaces and temples, delivering messages that directly opposed royal policy. Jezebel quickly saw them as a danger not just to her faith, but to the very power of the crown itself. The Bible frames her war on Yahweh's prophets as something much deeper than simple intolerance. It was a direct, active rebellion against God's supreme authority. By hunting down and silencing those voices, she did more than just push a state religion. She directly challenged Yahweh's right to speak to his people. Trying to silence God's voice turned what could have been a simple cultural disagreement into a full-scale spiritual war. Names mean everything in the biblical text. The name Jezebel actually means, "Where is the prince?" In Hebrew, this was likely a clever play on words, meaning, "Where is Baal?" Her name became a challenge answered when Baal failed to save her from the coup of Jew. On the other side, the name Elijah means, "My God is Yahweh." His very identity was a constant declaration in this massive spiritual war. The intense violence of her death matched ancient views of divine justice. The bloody purge by Jew wiped out Jezebel along with every single descendant of Ahab. This was seen as a holy cleansing, not political brutality. When dogs ate her corpse, leaving only her skull, feet, and palms, witnesses did not see a random pack of wild animals. They saw the exact fulfillment of prophecy. Every single detail proved that Yahweh always keeps his word and delivers judgment. Down the line, Hebrew prophets used her story to teach deeper spiritual lessons. Hosea, writing 100 years after her death, described Israel's unfaithfulness like an unfaithful wife, pointing a quiet finger back at Jezebel's corrupting influence. Ezekiel took this metaphor even further, calling Jerusalem a cheating bride. These prophets turned a simple political story into a powerful lesson about staying true to God's covenant. The fact that worship of one God survived through the ages shows just how crucial this ancient struggle really was. If her policies had won, and Baal worship became normal in Israel, the rise of exclusive monotheism might have failed entirely. Instead, the violent purges led by Jew and later kings drew a sharp, permanent line between Yahweh and other foreign gods, setting the stage for Judaism to grow into a unique faith. Later Christian thinkers found new meaning in this ancient drama. Jesus' warning against hypocritical leaders echoed Elijah's fight with false prophets. In the book of Revelation, Jezebel became a symbol for internal rot, which is far worse than any outside threat. The patient God who brought justice to the queen is the exact same God working through history to bring ultimate rescue to humanity. Through this entire drama, Yahweh shows qualities that set him far apart from any other ancient god. He is not tied to seasonal cycles or small territories. Instead, he works across generations, keeping his word and carrying out warnings long after the people involved are gone. The long decades between Elijah's warning and the queen's actual death reveal a patient God, one who works inside our human time while standing completely above it. Jewish mystics later discovered even deeper layers of meaning here. Kabbalistic teachers saw Jezebel as a symbol of the kelipot, those spiritual husks that block out the divine light. To them, her violent end symbolized breaking down the walls that keep humanity away from God. Even playing the villain, she still served a higher divine purpose. This showed how opposition actually sharpens spiritual truth rather than destroying it. The religious world Jezebel entered was already torn by centuries of tension between exclusive Yahwism and local syncretistic practices. Archaeological digs reveal household shrines with female figurines scattered all through Israelite settlements, which suggests that many ordinary families kept up older Canaanite customs alongside their worship of Yahweh. Her policies did not bring in completely foreign ideas so much as elevate existing local customs to official status. The God who remembered Jezebel has not forgotten her today. her story still shapes how we think about loyalty, compromise, and consequences. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities, though divided on many major beliefs, share a fierce devotion to one God, a faith partly forged in the fire of conflicts like hers. The theological lines she crossed have defined religious identity for billions over 3,000 years. Perhaps most profound of all is how her story shows divine power working through human choices. Neither Jezebel, nor Elijah, nor Jehu knew they were playing out a drama stretching far beyond 9th century BCE politics. Each made choices for immediate survival, power, ambition, or faith. Yet together they wove a pattern visible only from a great historical distance. The biblical writers did not see random events here, but a divine plan. For believers today, the God who kept his promises to ancient Israel still keeps his promises to them. For skeptics, the tale proves how powerful stories shape history, regardless of their literal truth. Either way, the clash between the queen and the prophet, between royal orders and divine commands, between immediate political survival and eternal moral truths, still echoes today. It is proof of how ancient wars shape who we are. She was the queen who refused to bend. Her final hour says it all. As Jehu's war chariot roared toward the palace, servants scattered and guards vanished. Jezebel had a choice to make. She could run, disguise herself, or beg for mercy. She chose none of those things. Instead, she painted her eyes with dark kohl, styled her hair, and stood proudly at the window overlooking the gate. Her final act was pure defiance, not surrender, a queen to the very end. But this makeup ritual before facing death has been badly misunderstood for thousands of years. Critics wrote it off as cheap vanity, as if she were trying to seduce her executioner. The truth goes much deeper. In the ancient Near East, royal clothing was a political statement. By putting on her full queenly robes, she met death not as a terrified victim, but as a princess of Tyre and queen of Israel. She died just as she lived, unbowed and unbroken, refusing to give up her identity or her power. Her last words, cut with sharp sarcasm, "Is it peace, Zimri, murderer of your master?" By naming Zimri a traitor who killed his king only to rule for 7 short days, she recognized Jehu's coup while mocking his future failure. Even standing on the edge of death, she did not sound like a victim, but like a ruler passing judgment on an impostor. That final clash sums up her entire life. Born to rule in Phoenicia, she refused to be sidelined as a quiet trophy queen in Israel. Though biblical writers hated her independence, it came naturally from her upbringing in Tyre's sophisticated court, where royal women held real authority. What Israel saw as a sin, she saw as her birthright. Yet running through her whole story is a golden thread we often miss. Consistency. Unlike kings who changed their policies with every shifting wind, Jezebel stood firm in her faith and heritage. From the day she entered Israel until her body fell from that window, she kept her Phoenician ways. Her enemies called this stubbornness, but it shows a rare kind of integrity that few ancient kings ever possessed. Think about what she faced: a foreign land that hated her customs, prophets screaming that her gods were fake, non-stop pressure to abandon who she was. A weaker person would have compromised to stay safe or liked. Jezebel refused, driven by deep religious conviction, cultural pride, or raw political strategy. She held her ground against impossible odds. This stubborn resolve wins a quiet respect even from her critics. Still, her methods are hard to defend. The bloody hunting of Yahweh's prophets, the rigged trial and murder of Naboth, the aggressive push for Baal worship. You cannot just excuse these as cultural differences, but they must be viewed in context. Ancient rulers did not care about democracy or freedom of religion. Every kingdom in the Near East pushed its own state religion using brutal power. What made Jezebel unique was not her harsh methods, but her foreign situation. A Phoenician princess pushing Phoenician gods on Israelite land. If she had forced Yahwism on Phoenicia instead, history would call her a brave missionary queen. If she had worshipped Baal quietly in her own chambers, Israel might have tolerated her as a harmless foreign bride. Her real crime was refusing to blend in and demanding that her native gods and traditions get equal respect in her new home. Modern women in power still face these same echoes today. Leaders who refuse to soften their tone or change their words to fit what society expects are still branded with words from Jezebel's shadow, manipulative, cold, scheming, and unnatural. A powerful woman who stands her ground still triggers deep cultural fears about female authority. Yet, despite thousands of years of hatred, a quiet respect for her courage runs through different views of her life. The Jewish scholar Tikva Frymer-Kensky pointed out that while biblical writers hated her actions, they never painted her as weak, scared, or indecisive. Other Christian scholars have noted that while most biblical women are only remembered in relation to their husbands or sons, Jezebel keeps a strong, distinct identity and real power throughout her story. Even her enemies recognized her massive influence. The fact that history always remembers her as beautiful is worth noting. Ancient writers rarely mentioned a woman's looks unless it served the plot. For Israel, her beauty was shorthand for foreign temptation, the dangerous pull of rituals that challenged their established traditions. Like Helen of Troy launching 1,000 ships, her beauty became a symbol representing the seductive power of cultural alternatives to exclusive Yahwism. Was she evil, or principled villain, or victim oppressor, or just different? Such questions miss the real truth of her complex life. Like most fascinating historical figures, she resists easy categories. A princess raised to honor ancient gods, a queen determined to protect her own identity, a woman who wielded power in ways her society found utterly unacceptable. She is far deeper than any simple morality tale can show. Perhaps what is most remarkable is how completely her beliefs matched her actions. Whether she was promoting Baal worship, confronting prophets, or facing death with steady dignity, Jezebel showed a rare alignment of belief and behavior. Though biblical writers condemned what she believed, the sheer strength of her devotion still commands attention across thousands of years. In the final accounting, Jezebel shows the true cost of defiance. Her story is not simply about wickedness being punished. It is about enforcing boundaries, religious boundaries, cultural boundaries, gender boundaries. The exact lines her very existence challenged at every single turn. The brutal details of her death, dogs devouring her flesh, the complete erasure of her burial place. These served as warnings against crossing lines a society held sacred. Yet she lives on, refusing to be forgotten, just as she refused to submit in life. Despite every effort to turn her into a simple cautionary tale, she emerges from ancient texts as fiercely human, ambitious, devoted to her gods, protective of her power, and unwilling to fade quietly into foreign customs. The woman who refused to bow in life refuses to lie flat in history. What is left when we strip away all the layers of gossip and myth? A Phoenician princess holding fast to her identity in hostile territory. A queen wielding power based on her own understanding of what royalty meant. A priestess honoring the gods she was raised from birth to worship. A woman facing death with a quiet, unbroken dignity. These details remain no matter what moral judgment we pass on her actions. Her painted eyes still look out at us across 3,000 years, challenging simple assumptions about power, gender fitting in, and exclusive faith. The queen who simply would not bow continues to ask hard questions about how societies treat outsiders, and how history remembers those who refuse to conform. In her steady gaze lies her final victory. Even in defeat, she is unforgettable.